The wind had a voice in this part of the country. It did not just whisper, it howled. A high, thin sound that scoured the land flat and drove the red dust into everything. It pushed against the small wagon, making the canvas flap like a frantic bird. The year was 1886, bleeding into the cold months of 1887. This was the High Plains, a vast, unforgiving stretch where Nebraska gave up trying and became Wyoming. Evelyn Hart pressed her face against the rough wood of the wagon bed, trying to find a place shielded from the biting air. She was 19 years old, an orphan. The word felt small and childish, and she had not felt like a child for many years. The pastor at the church, a man with kind eyes and a practical mouth, had called this an arrangement, a placement. Evelyn knew what it was. She was a burden, and a solution had been found. She was being sent to a place called Broken Mesa Ranch. She clutched the single carpet bag on her lap. It held everything she owned: 2 gray dresses, a set of needles and thread, a thick pair of wool socks, and a small, worn Bible. Tucked inside the Bible was a photograph of a woman she barely remembered, her mother. Evelyn could read, not just the scriptures, but the newspapers that sometimes made their way to the orphanage. She could write a clear hand. She could sew a seam that would not split, stretch a side of bacon to feed 6, and bake bread from flour that was more grit than grain. She also knew how to use the rifle that was currently stowed beneath the driver's seat. It was an old Spencer, heavy and awkward, but she could hit a fence post from 50 yards. It was a skill taught for self-defense, a necessary precaution for a woman alone. And she was entirely alone. The man she was being sent to was a name on a piece of paper: Luke McCrae. The pastor had provided the details, his voice low and serious. Mr. McCrae was a widower. His wife, Mary, had been dead for 2 years, taken by a fever that burned through the prairie in a single week. He was a man grown old before his time, somewhere between 32 and 35 years of age. He was, the pastor said, a good man, but a quiet one. Hardened, he carried a scar on his left shoulder, a slick, white mark left by a rustler's bullet from a fight over cattle 2 summers ago. A fight he had won, but barely. He was not the only resident of Broken Mesa Ranch. There were 5 children. Evelyn had memorized the list, a litany she repeated to the rhythm of the wagon wheels. May was the eldest, at 11 years. The pastor had called her watchful. Evelyn translated this to mean suspicious. May had been her mother's helper, and she would not welcome a stranger. Then came Cal, 10 years old, stubborn, the pastor said, angry. Cal was the boy trying to become the man of the house, his shoulders too narrow for the weight he was trying to carry. Jonah was 8. He was the gentle one, the boy who collected smooth stones and feathers, the one who probably still cried for his mother when he thought no one was listening. Bee was 6, a bright, quick girl. The pastor had smiled. Lan Loi. Perhaps she would be the first to yield, or perhaps her brightness was a sharp, defensive thing. And last was Finn, just 4 years old. He was, in the pastor's words, his father's shadow. He barely spoke. He just held on to Luke McCrae's trouser leg. A small, silent anchor. 5 children. The wind seemed to find a new crack in the wagon, and Evelyn shivered, pulling her thin coat tighter. She was not a mother. She was not a wife. She was a 19-year-old girl who knew how to load a rifle and bake bread. It did not feel like it was enough. The wagon rolled into Prairie's End, the town that served the scattered ranches. It was less a town and more a necessary scar on the landscape. There was a blacksmith's forge, its wide mouth breathing black smoke. Next to it, the general store, its windows dusty, offering overpriced flour, salt, and bolts of dull brown cotton. A white church stood at the end of the street, its paint peeling, its steeple looking small against the enormous, bruised sky. Across from it was the saloon, a place Evelyn looked away from quickly, though she could hear the faint sound of a piano and rough laughter. At the far edge, a small, square building with a single star painted on the door served as the marshal's office. It was a place that mostly dealt with land disputes and men who had drunk their wages. The air in Prairie's End was thick with more than dust. There were rumors. Men in dark suits, arriving on the eastbound train, had been seen in the saloon. They were from the railroad and land company. They spoke of progress, of new lines, of connecting the prairie to the cities in the east. They carried measuring chains and tripods, and they were mapping the valleys. They offered cash for land. Prices that sounded generous until one considered what the land would be worth once the tracks were down. They were speculators, and their presence made the air feel tight, charged with greed and suspicion. They wanted the land, and they wanted it cheap. Beyond the small circle of Prairie's End, the land stretched into what felt like forever, and out there, moving through the canyons and across the flat tops of the mesas, was Chayton. He was Lakota. His name was known in the territory. He had, for a time, worn the blue coat of a cavalry scout, his eyes and ears valued by the soldiers, but he had walked away from that life, shedding it like a skin. He had returned to the high plains, not as a warrior, but as a guardian. He watched over a specific bend in the river, a place his people considered sacred, a place the new maps did not honor. Chayton understood this world in a way the men with their tripods never could. He read the brokeback line of the horizon, the shift of the wind, the subtle tracks of a lone coyote. As easily as Evelyn read her Bible, he saw the new wooden stakes hammered into the ground near the river, and his face, usually calm, became still and hard. He knew what they meant. The sun was low, a weak, yellow smudge in the gray clouds. When the wagon finally turned off the main track, the atmosphere of the prairie was one of brutal honesty. It was cold. Winter was not coming. It was here. The grass was pale brown, brittle as glass. Hunger was not a distant possibility. It was a daily calculation. It was in the way the ranch wives measured flour, in the lean, hard bodies of the cowboys in town, in the hollow clang of a cowbell from a herd that seemed too thin. The sky was immense, pressing down, making everything human feel temporary and small. At Broken Mesa Ranch, the problems were not philosophical. They were immediate. The ranch itself was built for survival, not comfort. A long, low house made of sod and rough-cut timber, a solid barn, and several corrals, but the fences were sagging. A patch on the barn roof looked new and raw. Luke McCrae was in debt. The pastor had not known the exact amount, but the rumors in town were precise $500, owed to the bank in Cheyenne, a sum that might as well have been $5,000. To make it worse, his herd was sick, a sickness that made the cattle foam and limp, a foot and mouth plague that had already forced him to shoot and bury 6 head. He was losing his livelihood, hoof by hoof. The railroad and land company knew it. They knew about the debt. They knew about the sickness. They were waiting. They wanted his valley, the one that held the deep, reliable spring. They were waiting for him to break. Evelyn saw him before he saw her. He was standing on the porch of the longhouse, a tall man silhouetted against the dying light. He was not moving. He just watched the wagon approach. Luke McCrae watched the wagon stop. He did not move. He had told the pastor he did not need a wife. He had told him he did not need charity. He needed a hand, someone to manage the chaos inside the house so he could fight the chaos outside. His wife was gone. His heart, he thought, was gone with her. He had packed it away, buried it with Mary 2 years ago. There was no room for feeling. There was only work, debt, and the 5 small, demanding lives inside his house. He saw her climb down. She was just a girl, 19 years old. The pastor had said she looked younger. She was thin. Her coat was not thick enough for a Nebraska winter, and she held her bag in front of her like a shield. 5 small faces appeared at the window of the house, shadows in the gloom. May, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. Cal, trying to look tough, pushing Jonah back. Bee, her small face curious. and Finn, invisible, almost certainly clinging to the doorframe inside. Evelyn Hart took a breath. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. She smelled wood smoke and the sharp animal smell of the corrals. She looked at the man on the porch, at the house, at the 5 shadows in the window. This was it. This was the arrangement. Far off, on the ridge overlooking the valley, Chayton sat on his horse. He watched the girl. He watched the man. He had seen the sickness in McCrae's cattle. He had seen the railroad stakes by his sacred river. The wind moaned, and he pulled his buffalo robe tighter. The land was speaking of a hard winter, a very hard winter. The decision had been made for her 2 days before she stepped into the wagon. It happened in the small, clean office of Pastor Davies, a room that smelled of beeswax, old paper, and the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco. Evelyn Hart sat on a hard wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap. She had been summoned from the boarding house, where the church paid for her keep. She knew, with the instinct of an orphan who has long tracked the seasons of charity, that her time was up. Pastor Davies cleared his throat. He was a kind man, but his kindness was presently struggling against a hard necessity. He looked at the paper on his desk, not at her. "Evelyn," he began, his voice overly cheerful. "A solution has presented itself. A fine opportunity." Evelyn said nothing. She waited. Her stillness was a defense she had perfected over many years. "You know of Mr. Luke McCrae, I trust out at Broken Mesa Ranch." She nodded. She knew of him in the way everyone in Prairie's End knew of each other: a name, a tragedy, a piece of land, a widower. "Mr. McCrae is in need of assistance," the pastor continued, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes were strained. "His wife, Mary, God rest her soul, has been gone 2 years. He has the ranch to run and, well, 5 children. Evelyn, 5. "What assistance? Pastor?" Her voice was low, but it did not tremble. "He needs a woman's hand in the house," the pastor said, the words rushing out now. "Someone to manage the household, to cook, to clean, to look after the little ones. The board and I, we all agree. You are 19 years old. You are skilled in domestic arts, and you are of a devout and steady character. It is a suitable placement." The coldness started in her stomach and spread outward. A placement. She was 19 years old. She knew exactly what it meant when a devout girl was placed with a lone man, even one with 5 children. It was a transaction. She was currency, being used to settle the debt of her own existence. The fact that she was still a virgin, a detail she guarded with a fierce, quiet pride, felt suddenly like a commodity about to be spoiled. "He is a widower," she stated, the words tasting like ash. "And I am not a wife." "He has not asked for a wife," Pastor Davies said, perhaps too quickly. "He has asked for help. This is a respectable arrangement. Evelyn, a home, a purpose. It is God's will, and it is for the benefit of those poor children." He leaned forward, his kindness returning, now edged with a final, unbending authority. "The church board cannot fund your room at the boarding house past Friday. Winter is here. There are no other positions. This is the only door open. A home, or the street, a cold ranch house with a stranger and his 5 grieving children, or the freezing mud of Prairie's End. It was not a choice. It was a sentence. Evelyn Hart stood up. "I will need a day to prepare my things." The letter had arrived at Broken Mesa 3 days prior, carried by the circuit rider. Luke McCrae read it standing in the biting wind by his barn. He had been trying to reset a fence post in the iron-hard ground, and his hands were raw. He squinted at the fine linen paper, the elegant script so out of place in his world of mud and splintered wood. He read the pastor's careful words. "Miss Evelyn Hart, 19 years of age." He grunted. A girl. He needed a woman, someone who knew the hard work of a ranch house. Devout, Skilled in household duties. That meant she could sew. He needed someone who could butcher a hog and render lard. Raised in the church. That meant she had no family, no one to complain to. She is well suited to the care of 5 young children. His last help, a sour-faced widow from town, had lasted 4 days. She had left after Cal put a garter snake in her sewing basket, and May refused to speak a single word to her. Luke read the last line, and his mouth tightened into a thin, bitter line. We ask you to receive her. It is God's will, and for the benefit of the children. He crushed the paper in his fist. God's will had nothing to do with it. He was desperate. The house was chaos. Jonah had burned his hand on the stove 2 days ago trying to fry an egg. Finn's clothes were stiff with dirt. He could not fight the bank, and the sickness in his cattle, and the coming winter, and also fight the grime in his own home. He needed a body. He needed hands. He smoothed the paper out on the fence post. He took a piece of charcoal from his pocket and wrote 2 words on the bottom. Sender. He went inside the house. It was cold, the fire nearly dead. Finn was asleep on a pile of coats by the door. Bee was trying to braid May's hair, and May was jerking her head away, her face stormy. The air smelled of sour milk and old smoke. He looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, the one that had been Mary's. He had made no promises to the pastor. He would make none to the girl. His heart, or what was left of it, was reserved for his work and his children. His house needed a person in the kitchen. It did not need another ghost. The day before she was to leave, Evelyn went to the general store. She had 2 coins left, enough for a bar of lye soap and perhaps a length of sturdy thread. The store was the center of Prairie's End, a warm, dim place that smelled of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and oiled leather. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was weighing beans for a rancher. As Evelyn waited, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, she became aware of the sounds from the saloon next door. The wall was thin, and the voices of the men were clear. Heard McCrae's finally given in, one voice rumbled. Getting new stock. Not stock, another man corrected, followed by a coarse laugh. A wife. Some girl the church is shuffling off on him, 19 years old. They say... A low whistle. 19. Jesus, he's got 5 head of his own already. That's a rough trade. She'll be worn out by spring. If she lasts that long, May'll probably run her off, just like the last one. It ain't the girl I'm worried about. It's the land. Silas Ward was in here this morning. Said the railroad and land company is making its final offer on that valley. McCrae's got sickness in his herd. He's got the bank on his back. He won't last. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. She felt sick. She stepped back, bumping into a pickle barrel, and her coin slipped from her numb fingers, rolling across the dusty floorboards. Allow me, miss. A man bent smoothly to retrieve them. He was not a rancher. He wore a dark wool suit, clean and well-pressed. His boots were polished. His hands were soft. He smiled as he rose, but his eyes were cold and assessing. He tipped his hat. You must be new in town, he said, his voice as smooth as his suit. Evelyn could only nod. Taking the coins, her hand was shaking. Silas Ward. He introduced himself. I represent the railroad and land company. We are bringing the future to this fine territory. He gestured vaguely toward the valley. We are mapping a new route. Progress. You understand? Of course. Some of the old-timers are resistant. Mr. McCrae, for instance. He holds that valley. He paused, his smile fixed. We always offer a fair price, cash, immediately. It would save a man a lot of trouble. He looked at Evelyn, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew who she was. Or a young lady. He tipped his hat again and walked out, leaving the scent of bay rum and money in the air. Evelyn leaned against the counter, breathing hard. The gossip, the threat, it was all one and the same. A shadow fell over her. She turned, startled. A man was standing there. He had moved so quietly she had not heard him. He was Lakota, tall and lean, wearing a mix of worn wool trousers and a hide shirt. He had been in the back of the store, examining a display of knives. His face was weathered, his black hair braided. It was Chayton. He must have heard everything. The ugly talk from the saloon. Silas Ward's polite, venomous words. Evelyn braced herself, expecting contempt, or worse, pity. Chayton looked at her. His dark eyes saw not just a girl, but the fear, and the shame, and the stubborn line of her jaw. He saw the way she stood, straight-backed, even now. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, and then he gave a single, short nod. It was not pity. It was not kindness. It was acknowledgement. It was the nod of one survivor to another. It said, "I see you. The land is hard. Be harder." He paid for his tobacco in silence and was gone, as quiet as smoke. That one small, silent gesture steadied Evelyn more than all of Pastor Davies's prayers. It was a single, unexpected spark of hope. She bought her soap and her thread, her chin held high. That night, she packed her small carpet bag. The room was cold, the candle guttering. She pulled a thin silver chain from beneath her dress. On it hung a small, dented silver locket. She opened it. Inside was the tiny, faded image of a woman with Evelyn's own eyes, her mother, her only link to a family, to a life before the church, before the arrangements. She held it tight in her palm. This locket was her past. Broken Mesa Ranch was her future. A grieving, silent man. 5 children she had never met. A ranch failing under debt and sickness. A town that whispered about her. A railroad man who smelled like a predator. She thought of the children. May, 11, already suspicious and hurt. Cal, 10, angry at a world that had taken his mother. Jonah, 8, the gentle one. B, 6, the quick one. And Finn, 4 years old, a silent shadow. She knew what it was to be alone. She knew what it was to be the child in the room that no one knew what to do with. They needed a cook. They needed someone to mend their clothes. They needed, she thought, someone to make the bread and sweep the floor and maybe, just maybe, tell them a story before they slept. She was 19. She was terrified, but she was not weak. She fastened the locket around her neck, tucking it back under her dress, the cold metal a shock against her skin. She would go, not for God's will, not for the pastor. She would go because it was the only choice she had. She would go for her own survival. And as she blew out the candle, a new thought, small and fierce, took root. She would go for them. She, an orphan, would go and look after the orphans. The next morning, the wagon was waiting to take her to Broken Mesa. The road to Broken Mesa Ranch was not a road. It was a pair of ruts, a suggestion of passage carved into the gray-brown land. The wagon driver, a man named Peters who had been paid by the church, had not spoken more than 10 words to Evelyn in 2 hours. She did not mind. The silence was a cold blanket, and she wrapped herself in it, bracing against the jolts. They had to cross what the locals called the Spreading River. It was not deep, but it was wide and treacherous. A mile of shallow, silt-heavy water that changed its course with every season. The wagon wheels sank into the mud, and the mules strained, their muscles bunching. Evelyn held her small trunk with both hands, her knuckles white. She felt the wagon lurch and slide, a sickening, uncontrolled motion, before the wheels finally found purchase on the far bank. No sooner had they climbed the rise from the riverbed than the world disappeared. The wind, which had been a constant, whining complaint, suddenly became a roar. A wall of red dust, a churning cloud from the plains, swallowed the sun and the sky. "Cover your face!" Peters yelled, his voice torn away by the gale. Evelyn fumbled for her thin shawl, pressing it over her mouth and nose. The air was thick, suffocating. She tasted grit and panic. The wagon stopped. There was nothing to do but endure. She bowed her head. Her body curled around the trunk. It was her only anchor in the screaming red darkness. Her heart beat against her ribs, a frantic drumming that felt like hooves. Just as suddenly as it had come, the storm passed, the wind dropped, and the dust began to settle, revealing a world painted a dull, uniform brown. "Broken Mesa," Peters grunted, pointing with his whip. The gate was ahead. The name was carved into a plank of gray wood, the letters uneven. The ranch house sat low to the ground, a long, grim building of sod and timber that looked as if it had grown from the earth, not been built upon it. A man was standing by the porch. He was tall, and he stood leaning slightly, one hand resting on a heavy stock saddle he was holding by the horn. He was not waiting for them. He looked as if they had interrupted him. As the wagon creaked in, Luke McCrae did not move. Peters hauled the wagon to a stop. "Got your passenger, McCrae?" Evelyn gathered her skirt, her legs stiff and trembling. She climbed down from the wagon, her boots sinking into the fine, damp dust. She stood there, 19 years old, her face streaked with dirt, her thin coat offering no protection from the cold that was already seeping into her bones. Luke McCrae's eyes, the color of a winter sky, moved over her. It was not a look of welcome. It was an assessment, like a man judging livestock. "Mr. Peters," he said, his voice a low, rough sound, as if he did not use it often. "You can set her trunk on the porch." He addressed the driver, not her. Evelyn felt a familiar, hot wave of humiliation creep up her neck. She was not a passenger. She was cargo. As Peters grumbled and lifted the trunk, Luke finally looked at her fully. "Pastor Davies wrote you were help. He said he spoke the word help as if it tasted bad. We need to be clear from the start. Miss, I don't need help." Evelyn's head came up, her spine straightening instinctively. "This ranch," he continued, his gaze flat and empty, "needs a long-term housekeeper for the children. That is the only position available. There is no promise of courtship. There is no promise of marriage. It is a position of work. Do you understand me?" He was laying down the terms. He was drawing a line in the dirt before she had even taken a step on it. She was 19 years of age. She was a virgin, and he was, in his own brutal way, telling her he had no intention of changing that. The whispers of the town, of her being shuffled off on him, were in his mind as well. The blood rushed to her cheeks, a painful, burning blush against the cold. She hated him for it. She hated him for making her feel cheap, for confirming that she was nothing but a transaction. But she looked past him, at the 5 silent figures on the porch. She looked at May, who was glaring, and Cal, who was trying to spit, and Jonah, whose eyes were just wide and frightened. She took a breath, the cold air burning her lungs. "I understand, Mr. McCrae," she said, her voice quiet but not shaking. "It is work, but if I am to take the position, my terms are these." Luke's eyebrows drew together. He had not expected this. "I will have an equal say in the running of the kitchen," Evelyn stated, meeting his cold gaze. "I will have the final word on the medicines and the care of the children, and I will have a say in the safety of this house." A moment of pure, raw silence descended. Luke McCrae stared at this wisp of a girl, this orphan covered in red dust, who was standing on his land and setting terms. A muscle in his jaw jumped. He saw the flash of steel beneath the fear. He had expected tears or meekness. He had received a demand. "You will have a say," he said finally. His voice clipped. "When you have earned it, take your trunk inside. The room at the end of the hall is yours." He turned, as if to dismiss her, but a sound made him pause. The clop of a fine horse, moving at a relaxed, confident pace. A rider approached, stopping just outside the sagging gate. He was the man from the store, Silas Ward. He was dressed in his same fine wool suit, his boots polished. He sat on a beautiful bay horse that looked utterly out of place in this yard of dirt and struggling cattle. "McCrae," Silas called out, his voice smooth and friendly. "A busy afternoon. You have company." His eyes slid to Evelyn, taking in her youth, her cheap coat, and the trunk on the porch. His gaze was quick, calculating. Luke's hand tightened on the saddle horn. "Just business, Ward." "Good, good," Silas said, smiling. He looked around the yard, his eyes noting the sagging fence, the thin cattle in the far corral. "I was just passing by. I heard you might be considering selling." Evelyn turned to Luke. "The railroad and land company is still interested," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a sympathetic tone. "We are still offering cash. It is a hard winter coming. McCrae, a man with responsibilities, should think about a fair offer." "You heard wrong," Luke said, his voice flat and dead. "And you are on my land." Silas's smile did not waver. "Just being neighborly. An offer of help, that's all." He tipped his fine hat, his gaze lingering on Evelyn for a second too long, a gesture that felt both intimate and insulting. "Miss." He turned his horse in a fluid, easy motion and rode away. Luke McCrae watched him go, his body rigid. He was a statue of contained rage. Evelyn watched him, and she watched the straight, confident back of Silas Ward disappear. She had been planted, like a seed, in the middle of a war she did not understand. Luke let out a long breath, but he did not move. His gaze lifted, scanning the high, broken ridge that gave the ranch its name. Evelyn followed his look. She saw it, though she did not understand it. Far up on the ridge, barely visible, was an arrow. It was stuck in the earth, angled down toward the house. Tied to its shaft was a small, fluttering piece of white cloth. As Luke saw it, the tension in his shoulders eased. It was a subtle shift, a slight lowering, as if a weight he had been holding was momentarily set down. He had received a message. He turned, hoisting the heavy saddle onto his good shoulder, the one without the scar. He grunted at Evelyn. "Get inside and tell the children to wash. Supper is at 6. He strode toward the barn, leaving her alone on the porch with her trunk and the 5 watching children. The house was one large room that served as kitchen, dining room, and living space. It smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and old beans. A fire guttered in the hearth, giving off more smoke than heat. The children scattered as she entered, vanishing into a darker room beyond. A bed, a cot. She pushed her trunk against the wall. The first night was a kind of quiet hell. She found flour and beans and salt pork. She made a simple, heavy meal. The children ate at the long, scarred table in a ferocious, animal silence. They stared at her. May, the eldest, watched Evelyn's every move, her eyes cold with judgment. Cal kicked the leg of the table, a rhythmic, angry thud. Jonah spilled his mug of water, and May cuffed him on the head, a sharp, practiced motion. "There is no hitting at this table," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the silence. May's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You are not my mother." "No," Evelyn said calmly, sopping up the water with a rag. "I am not, but there is no hitting at this table." May stared her down, but she did not hit Jonah again. Later, when the gray twilight had turned to black, she heard crying. It came from the children's room, a cold, dark space where cots and straw ticks were lined up against the wall. She pushed the door open. It was Bee, the 6-year-old. Her small body was shaking under a thin blanket. Evelyn walked over and sat on the edge of the cot. May tensed in the next bed, watching her in the dark. "Leave her be," May whispered, her voice fierce. "She does not want you." Evelyn ignored her. She lightly touched Bee's shoulder. The girl flinched. "The wind is loud tonight," Evelyn whispered. Bee nodded, her face buried in the pillow. "It is angry. It is a storm." "I do not think it is angry," Evelyn said, her voice soft. She remembered the red dust, the screaming noise. "I think it is singing. It is just a very old, very lonely song. It is singing about all the things it has seen. It saw the mountains get born, and it is singing about them. It is just a very loud singer, practicing its scales." Bee's sobs quieted, turning into small, hitched breaths. "A singing storm." "That is right," Evelyn said. "You just have to listen past the noise to hear the music." She stayed there, one hand on the blanket, humming a tune she barely remembered, until Bee's breathing was deep and even. When she finally stood up, her back aching from the cold floor, she saw May. The 11-year-old girl was a shadow in the doorway. She had been watching. Her face was hidden in the darkness, but the rigid, hostile line of her shoulders had softened. She just watched Evelyn for a long moment, and then, without a word, she slipped back to her own bed. Evelyn went to her own room. It was a tiny, cold space, little more than a storage closet with a cot. She sat down, her small trunk at her feet. She was 19 years old. She had been humiliated by the man of the house, challenged by his children, and threatened by a stranger, all in the space of a few hours. This was not a home. It was a battlefield. She thought of Silas Ward's cold eyes and his talk of a fair offer. She thought of Luke McCrae's hard, empty gaze. Then she thought of Bee's small, frightened sobs, and the way they had quieted. She thought of May's silent, watchful presence in the hall. She was here. She had accepted the terms. She looked at her trunk, which held everything from her old life. Slowly, she unlatched it. She did not take out her Bible. She did not take out the locket. She took out a clean, folded apron. She smoothed it with her hands, folded it again, and placed it on the end of the cot, ready for the morning. She would stay. She would keep the fire. She would guard her own heart. She would protect these 5 children. She would hold this one small, broken house against the wind. The kitchen at Broken Mesa Ranch was a place of constant, grim arithmetic. Evelyn Hart learned its rules in her first week. She had come to the ranch with the expectation of hardship, but the reality of the larder was starker than she had imagined. The butter crock held only a yellow smear at the bottom. The flour barrel, which should have been full heading into winter, was less than a quarter occupied. And the flour itself was old, flecked with bran and tasting of the barrel wood. There was salt pork, but not enough. There were beans, which they ate every night. She learned to make cornbread from the old flour, cut with yellow meal. She rendered every scrap of bacon fat, saving it in a jar to use in place of butter. She learned to make a thin, savory stew from 1 jackrabbit and a handful of withered onions. She was not just cooking. She was waging a small, daily war against starvation. Luke McCrae watched her. He saw her measuring the flour, her mouth set in a thin, worried line. He saw her recalculating the portions for the 5 children, always ensuring her own was the smallest. He said nothing. His pride was a wall of stone, and he would not discuss his poverty with this 19-year-old girl. One morning, he went into the barn. He stood for a long time looking at a saddle, not the one he used daily, but a finer one. It was stamped with a floral pattern, the leather oiled and dark. It had been his father's. He hoisted it onto his shoulder, his face grim, and saddled his horse. He rode to town. He did not say where he was going. Evelyn watched him go. She turned back to the kitchen, her anxiety a cold knot in her stomach. If he sold a horse, they would be crippled. He returned 5 hours later. His horse was breathing hard, and the spot where the second saddle usually hung was empty. But in the wagon bed were 2 large sacks of white flour, a new side of bacon, a 10-pound bag of sugar, and 3 heavy sacks of cattle feed. He unloaded them wordlessly, stacking them by the kitchen door. He did not look at her. He just left the provisions and went back to the barn. Evelyn put her hand on the soft, cool muslin of the flour sack. He had not apologized for the empty larder. He had simply filled it. She went out to the barn later, on the pretext of gathering eggs. The fine, flowered saddle was gone. She understood the transaction. He had sold a piece of his past to provide for their present. It was the first time she felt something other than fear or resentment toward him. It was a sliver of respect. With the coming of the deep cold, the children were trapped inside. The wind howled for 3 days straight, driving snow against the windows. The house, already small, felt like a cramped wooden box. Cal had taken to whittling sticks, leaving sharp, messy shavings all over the floor, his face sullen. May just stared out the window, her gaze as bleak as the landscape. Evelyn knew this idleness was a poison. On the 4th day, she swept Cal's shavings into the hearth. "We will have lessons," she announced, her voice louder than she intended. May turned from the window. "I already know how to read." "Then you will read this." Evelyn said. She retrieved her Bible from her trunk. It was the only book she owned. Out loud, Genesis chapter 1. May's lip curled, but she took the book. She read, her voice halting, stumbling over words like firmament and dominion. She could read, but she could not read well. "Cal," Evelyn said, wiping the long kitchen table clean. She dipped her finger in the soot by the fire and drew a large letter A on the wood. "This is your name. You will learn to write it." "That's not my name," he grumbled. "It is the start of it," she said, her patience as thin as the ice on the water bucket. "Now, copy it." She turned to Jonah. He was watching, his eyes wide, soaking everything in. She had seen him arranging pebbles in neat rows by the porch. She pulled a handful of dried beans from a jar. She laid 2 on the table. Then she laid 2 more beside them. "How many, Jonah?" "4, he whispered. She smiled. She laid out 3 and 3 more. 6. He was quick. The numbers made sense to him in a way the letters did not. B and Finn were too small for letters or sums, so Evelyn sat them on the floor by the hearth, where it was warmest. She taught them a song, one her own mother had hummed, about a gray goose and a silver moon. Their small, piping voices were a strange counterpoint to May's somber reading and Cal's frustrated scratching. The kitchen, which had been a place of cold silence and angry muttering, was now filled with sound. It was the sound of a simmering pot, the scratching of soot on wood, the drone of a child reading, the quiet counting of beans, and a simple, repetitive song. Luke McCrae stood in the doorway of the barn, listening. He had been mending harness, his fingers stiff with cold. He had come to the house for hot water. He stood there for a full minute, unseen, watching this girl command his children. She had brought order. She had turned his chaotic, grieving kitchen into a schoolhouse. He did not go inside. He turned and went back to the cold barn, a strange, complicated feeling settling in his chest. The sickness in his cattle did not wait for the lessons to finish. It returned, this time with a vengeance. Evelyn was awakened one night by the sound of a man cursing. It was Luke, out in the yard. She pulled on her coat and ran outside. The night was clear and freezing, the stars like chips of ice. Luke was in the sick pen, a lantern held high. 2 cows were down. They're breathing a ragged, wet cough that tore the air. They were 2 of his last 6 healthy animals. "Get back inside," he snarled at her, not looking. He was frantic. "What is it?" "It's the sickness," he said, his voice hoarse with despair. "Their lungs are filling. They will be dead by morning." He knelt beside a small calf, the offspring of one of the sick cows. The calf was shivering, its head lolling. "Damn it all!" Evelyn looked at the animals, at the man. He was beaten. He was watching his livelihood die. and he was powerless. She remembered 2 days before, she had been hanging the laundry, her fingers freezing to the wet cloth. She had seen Chaitin. He was on the ridge, sitting on his horse, just watching. He had not come to the house, but after he had gone, she had found a small bundle tied with sinew on a fence post, dried herbs, sharp-smelling, like pine and sage and mint. She ran back to the house, Luke yelling after her. She stoked the fire, threw water in the pot. She crushed the strange, dry leaves. They filled the room with a powerful, clean scent. She made a hot, dark tea, pouring it into a tin. She ran back to the barn. Luke stared at her as if she were mad. "What is that witchcraft?" "Chaitin left it," she said, breathless. "It is medicine." Luke looked at the dying calf. He looked at the steaming tin. He was a man of science, as much as the prairie allowed. He believed in ledgers and fences. This was something else, but he was desperate. "Go on," he grunted. Evelyn knelt in the mud and manure. She pulled the calf's head into her lap. She forced its mouth open, pouring the warm, bitter liquid down its throat. She did not know if she was helping or hurting. The calf coughed and struggled weakly, then lay still. "Now we wait," she said. Luke did not leave. He stood, his arms crossed, watching the 2 cows. Evelyn did not leave. She sat in the hay, stroking the calf, her hands sticky with the herbal mash. They did not speak for hours. The moon moved across the sky. Just before the false dawn, when the air was at its coldest, the calf shivered, a violent spasm, and then it lifted its head. It coughed, a dry, racking sound. Not the wet rattle of before. It tried to stand. Luke let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a year. The 2 mother cows were still gravely ill, but the calf, the smallest and weakest, was alive. He looked at Evelyn. Her face was pale with exhaustion. Her dress was ruined. She was looking at the calf, a small, weary smile on her face. Luke cleared his throat. You manage this house, this sickness. You manage it like you are the master of it." Evelyn looked up at him. It was the first time he had looked at her with anything other than suspicion or cool assessment. It was respect. It warmed her more than the fire ever could. Her new, fragile confidence was tested when she went to Prairie's End for salt and molasses. She had harnessed the old mule to the buckboard, handling the reins with a competence that surprised herself. As she passed the saloon, the doors swung open, letting out a cloud of cigar smoke and the tinny sound of the piano. Mistress Gable, the saloon owner's wife, a large woman with iron-gray hair and a sharp tongue, was standing on the boardwalk. "Well, if it is not the little mother," she called out, her voice loud enough for the men inside to hear. "Still playing house out at Broken Mesa, dearie." Evelyn felt her face burn. The men laughed. "How long you give her?" one man yelled. "I've got $2 on Christmas." "McRae's too proud," another voice said. "But he is broke. That Silas Ward will have that valley before the spring thaw. And the girl, too, maybe." Evelyn snapped the reins, her humiliation a physical sickness. She urged the mule on, her back straight, her ears ringing with their laughter. She was a topic of gossip, a piece in a bet. She finished her business at the general store, her hands shaking as she counted out Luke's coins. She avoided everyone's eyes. On her way out of town, she passed the small, peeling church. Miss Hart. It was the pastor's wife, Mistress Davies. She hurried out from the side door, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle. "You left this," she said, pressing it into Evelyn's hands. "I did not order anything," Evelyn said, confused. "For the children," the woman whispered. She looked around, as if afraid of being seen. "The cold is hard on them. This is from a few of the mothers. We pray for you." She patted Evelyn's hand and vanished back inside. Evelyn drove the wagon out of town. When she was on the open prairie, She stopped and opened the bundle. Inside was a full pound of fresh, sweet butter, 2 jars of pickled beets, and a small sack of sugar cookies. She sat there for a long time, the cold wind whipping her hair. The town was a monster with 2 faces, one that mocked her in the light and one that fed her in the shadows. She knew she had to thank Chayton. She saw his smoke a few days later, a thin gray line rising from the cottonwoods down by the spreading river. She left the children with May in charge and walked the 2 miles. He was sitting by a small, nearly smokeless fire, polishing a knife. He nodded as she approached, as if he had been expecting her. "The calf is alive," she said. "Thank you." He gestured to a smooth stone by the fire. "The earth gives the medicine. I only carried it." She sat, warming her hands. She looked at the river, wide and gray and slow. "This is the sacred water," he said, not looking at, "You call it the spreading river. My people call it the river that breathes. It gives life. The men with the sticks," he meant Silas Ward's surveyors, "they want to put a fence here. They want to tell the water where to go. The water does not listen. The bison did not listen. They followed the water. That," he said, touching his chest, "is freedom. Knowing the true path, not the one men draw on maps." Evelyn listened. She watched the water flow. She was learning that the fight with Silas Ward was not just about land, but about the water. She was tested again that week, a different kind of test. She was woken from a shallow sleep not by a cough, but by a sound that chilled her blood. The low, tearing growl of a wolf. It was answered by a second, and a third. She ran to the main room. The children were huddled by the cold hearth. May was holding Finn, her face white. "Where is your father?" Evelyn demanded.
"The far pasture,"
May whispered, her voice shaking. "He went to check the cows." A frantic bleating came from the sheep pen, not 50 yards from the house. "You, bar the door after me."
"No,"
May screamed.
"you cannot. They will kill you."
Evelyn grabbed the heavy Spencer rifle from the pegs by the door. She checked the load.
"Bar the door."
She burst onto the porch. The moon was high, flooding the yard with cold, blue light. She saw them, 4 gray shadows, sleek and fast, circling the pen. One, a large male, was already digging at the base of the fence. Her heart was a drum. She was 19 years old, standing in her thin cotton nightgown, facing a wolf pack. She raised the rifle. Her arms shook. She remembered the shooting lessons at the orphanage. Aim for the post. She would not be a killer. She would be a guardian. She aimed high, into the blackness above the wolves. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was a brutal, deafening crack. The rifle kicked, slamming into her shoulder, bruising the bone. The sound echoed off the mesa. The wolves vanished. They did not run. They simply dissolved into the night, as if they had been ghosts. Evelyn leaned against the porch rail, gasping, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. The door flew open. May stood there, staring. Behind her, Cal and Jonah looked at Evelyn with a new, stunned awe. Luke came running from the pasture, his own rifle in his hand. "In God's name, what was that?" He saw her, the rifle, the quiet sheep. "Wolves," she said, her voice shaking. "They were in the pen." He stared at her. He looked at the heavy rifle, then back at her small frame. He said nothing. He just walked to the pen, checking the fence, his face unreadable in the moonlight. Evelyn went inside, her shoulder throbbing. She bolted the door. She found May in the kitchen, scrubbing an already clean pot, her back rigid. "That was my mother's," May said, her voice a low, furious whisper. "What was?" Evelyn asked, confused.
"The rifle. That was her rifle. She shot a coyote once, from the porch."
Evelyn understood. "May, you think you can just come here?" May spun around, her eyes flashing with tears she refused to let fall. You think you can sing to B and teach Jonah his numbers and shoot my mother's gun. You think you can just take her place. The jealousy was raw, a living thing in the small, cold kitchen. Every small victory for Evelyn was a fresh betrayal of May's dead mother.
He talked to you,
May whispered, the accusation sharp.
He said you were the master. He never talked to anyone like that, not since she died.
May threw the cleaning rag into the dirty water, splashing Evelyn's dress. She ran from the room, her sobs finally breaking free. Evelyn stood alone in the center of the kitchen. The wolves had been easy. They were just hungry. This girl's hunger, this grief, was something she did not know how to fight. The tension with May settled over the house like a second winter. The 11-year-old girl was polite, her obedience sharp and wounding. She did her chores without being asked, her silence a constant accusation. Evelyn felt the sting of it. She focused on the work, on the small routines that kept the household running. The truce was fragile, and the cold was deepening. It was Cal who brought the news. He burst into the kitchen, his face red from the wind, his eyes wide with alarm. "There are men by the spring," he yelled. "Men with sticks." Evelyn dropped the dish rag. Luke was out on the north ridge, mending a fence line.
"Stay here,"
she ordered May.
"Bar the door."
She did not grab the rifle this time. She pulled on her coat and ran. The spring was the lifeblood of Broken Mesa. It was tucked into a small hollow, sheltered by cottonwoods. A mile from the house, it was the only reliable water for 2 miles in any direction. She saw them. 3 men. They were not ranchers. They wore city hats and canvas coats. They were driving wooden stakes into the hard, cold ground, unwinding a long metal chain. A tripod was set up nearby. "What are you doing?" Evelyn demanded, her voice sounding small in the vast quiet. The men stopped, surprised. One of them, a heavy man with a gray beard, smirked. "Surveying, Missy, official business." "This is Broken Mesa land," Evelyn said, though she had no idea where the boundaries actually were. "That," the man said, gesturing to the stake he had just hammered, "is a matter of opinion. According to our maps, the spring sits on the line, and the railroad and land company is very interested in the land on that side of the line."
"You cannot,"
she said, her voice shaking.
"Our cattle—"
"Your cattle are Mr. McCrae's problem," the man said, turning back to his work. "We have papers. You best run back to the house."
She did. She ran until her lungs burned. Luke was just riding in. She met him at the gate, gasping out the story. "Men, by the spring, they are driving stakes."
She had never seen his face like that. The quiet, weary sadness vanished, replaced by a cold, immediate rage. He did not dismount. He wheeled his horse, the animal sensing his fury, and galloped toward the spring. Evelyn ran back to the house, her heart pounding. The day of reckoning, the one whispered about in town, had arrived. Luke returned 2 hours later. His face was gray. "They have papers," he said, his voice dead. "From Cheyenne. They say the original survey was improper. They say the spring is boundary water."
"What does that mean?"
"It means," he said, pulling the saddle from his horse with one violent jerk,
"that Silas Ward is claiming half of it, and the half he claims is the one that feeds the stream to my pastures."
If they lost the spring, the ranch would die of thirst. The next day was the monthly stock market in Prairie's End. It was not a choice. Luke had to go. He needed to sell 2 steers, even at a loss, to get cash for the tax bill. Evelyn insisted on going with him.
"I need to be there,"
she said. "It is no place for you," he argued. "The children are your concern. The house is mine. The water is both." He looked at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw. He nodded. "Once." Prairie's End was crowded. Ranchers, cowboys, and townsfolk gathered in the muddy street. The air smelled of manure, cheap whiskey, and desperation. Luke found the auctioneer, his face a mask of iron. Evelyn stood by the wagon. She saw Silas Ward. He was standing on the boardwalk of the saloon, smoking a cigar, looking like a king. He was talking to Pastor Davies. Evelyn watched the pastor. He was nodding, his face troubled, wringing his hands. She saw Silas pat him on the shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that looked like ownership. The church took donations from the railroad and land company. The pastor, she realized, was caught. Luke finished his business, his face tighter than before. The steers had sold for $20 less than he had hoped. As he walked toward the wagon, Silas Ward stepped off the boardwalk to intercept him. "McCrae," Silas said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "A hard day for the market." Luke just looked at him. "Get out of my way, Ward." "I hear you had visitors," Silas said, his smile polite, his eyes gleaming. "My surveyors. Good men, very precise." "They are trespassers," Luke said, his voice low and dangerous. "They are agents of progress." Silas countered smoothly. "The law is the law. McCrae, the spring is on the line. But I am a reasonable man. I am prepared to buy your entire claim. Cash. The ranch is not for sale." "Is it not?" Silas's voice dropped, becoming silky and sharp. "That is not what the county tax office says. I was just reviewing the books. You are—" "Let me see. 2 months late on your property taxes. Another 30 days, and the county seizes it for auction. And I will be the only bidder." It was a knife, slid cleanly between Luke's ribs. The small crowd that had gathered went silent. This was not a dispute. This was an execution. "You stay away from my land," Luke said, his hand moving toward his hip. "I do not have to," Silas said, not moving, not blinking. "The law will bring it to me. Sell now. McCrae, take the cash. Walk away with something. For the girl, for the children." Luke's body was rigid. Evelyn saw the scar on his shoulder, white against his flannel shirt. She saw the impulse to violence warring with the crippling reality of the tax bill. He turned, his face ashen, and grabbed Evelyn's arm. "We are leaving." He pulled her toward the wagon. He had not fought. He had retreated, because Silas Ward had been right. They rode back to Broken Mesa in a terrible, thick silence. The money from the steers was not enough. The tax bill was crippling. He was short. That night, Luke did not eat. He sat at the table, staring at the ledger book, his head in his hands. Evelyn found Chayton 2 days later. He was not at the river. He was on the ridge, the one overlooking the spring. He was watching the stakes. "He will take the water," Evelyn said, no preamble. She was too tired for manners. "He will try." Chayton said, "He has papers. He says the law is on his side." Chayton turned his gaze to her. "His law? There is an older one." He gestured for her to follow him. He led her not to the spring, but half a mile upstream, into a narrow, rocky draw that Evelyn had never explored. The wind was quieter here. "The men with maps," Chayton said. "They look at paper. They do not look at the land." He stopped at a large, flat-topped boulder. It looked like any other rock. Chayton knelt, brushing away snow and a covering of dead leaves. There, carved deep into the stone, was a symbol. It was not a picture. It was a series of lines, a starburst connected to a long, winding groove. "This is a water marker," Chayton said, "from my grandfather's. It shows the spring, and it shows the lines of sharing." He traced the grooves that radiated from the center. "The water belongs to the land. It belongs to all who live on the land. It is common." "It is a rock," Evelyn said, her heart sinking. "Silas Ward will laugh at this." "He will laugh," Chayton agreed. "His law is written on paper. This law is written in stone. Is there anything else, a treaty, a paper from the government?" Chayton shook his head. The paper was smoke. The soldiers came. They talked. They made promises. The treaty was signed, and then it was lost. The men who signed it are dead. The paper is gone. Only the stone remains, and the stories of the old ones. It was not enough. It was history, not law. Evelyn looked toward Prairie's End, though she could not see it. The town council, they are split. Pastor Davies, he listens to Silas. He listens to the money. Chayton said simply, the railroad money builds his new roof. She left him there, by the ancient stone, her hope colder than the air. The evidence was a carving and an old man's story. It was nothing. The cold, the fear, and the bad food finally found a victim. It was not the cattle this time. It was Finn. He had been listless all day, refusing to eat. That night, Evelyn heard him, a small, dry cough from the children's room. She went in. He was burning. His skin was hot and dry, his breathing shallow. By midnight, he was delirious. He thrashed on his cot, crying for his mother. May, get me cold water and rags, Evelyn ordered. May, her own fear eclipsing her jealousy, flew to obey. Evelyn sat on the edge of the cot, bathing the 4-year-old's face. The fever was too high. It was the kind that had taken her own mother. Luke stood in the doorway, a massive, helpless silhouette. He watched her work. He watched his youngest son fight for every breath. He is just like Mary, he whispered, his voice cracking. Evelyn looked up, startled. She burned like this, he said, his hand gripping the door frame. I brought the doctor from town. He did. Nothing. He just watched her go. I cannot. He stepped into the room, his movements clumsy. I am afraid of losing another one. Evelyn. It was the first time he had used her name. He knelt by the cot, his big rough hand hovering over his son's small chest. He looked broken. The man who faced down rustlers and railroad agents was terrified of this fever, this invisible enemy. Evelyn dipped the rag in the bowl. The water was icy. She laid it on Finn's forehead. The boy whimpered and thrashed, pushing it away. Hold him, Evelyn said. Luke put his hands on Finn's shoulders, steadying him. Evelyn tried again, her hand small and steady, pressing the cold cloth to his temple. Shh, Finn, she whispered, the same words she had used for Bee. It is just the wind. It is just a loud song. Finn's eyes, unfocused, rolled toward her voice. He quieted for a moment. Evelyn kept her hand on the cloth, pressing the coolness into his skin. Luke watched her. He watched her gentle, persistent touch. He watched the way his son, even in his delirium, seemed to lean into her hand, slowly, as if it were moving against his will. Luke's hand covered hers. It was not a caress. It was a gesture of pure, desperate solidarity. His hand was huge, calloused, and trembling. It covered hers completely, pressing her hand down onto his son's forehead. It was a shared burden, a shared plea. Heat flared where he touched her. It was not passion. It was recognition. It was the first human touch she had felt in years that was not a shove, a pat on the head, or an accident. It was a connection. They stayed like that for a long time, the two of them, a strange tableau in the cold. Dark room, a 19-year-old orphan and a 35-year-old widower, their hands joined, trying to hold a small boy to the earth. The fever did not break that night, or the next day. For 48 hours, Evelyn did not sleep. She brewed the last of Chayton's herbs. She forced broth and water between Finn's lips. She sat, she bathed, she waited. Luke stayed near. He took over the kitchen, his cooking clumsy but determined, freeing her to stay with Finn. He watched her, his silence no longer cold, but full of a new, raw gratitude. On the third morning, Evelyn was asleep in the chair, her head fallen against the wall. She woke with a start. The room was silent. Finn's cot was empty. Panic seized her. She jumped up, her heart stopping. She ran to the main room. Luke was at the table. Finn was on his lap, wrapped in a thick blanket. Awake, his eyes were clear. He was weakly eating a piece of toast dipped in milk. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, her legs giving way with relief. Luke looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, but he was smiling. A real, small, rusty smile. "The fever broke," he said, his voice thick. Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. He had made a decision. She could see it in his face. He watched his son eat, and he looked at the ledger book on the table. The one with the tax bill. He looked at the rifle on the wall. He had almost lost his son. He would not lose his home. He would not let Silas Ward take the spring. He did not know how, but the retreat was over. He would fight. Evelyn went back to her small room and splashed cold water on her face. She looked at her reflection in the cracked piece of mirror. She was pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She looked older than 19. She thought of the moment Luke's hand had covered hers. She thought of Finn, awake and eating toast. She thought of May's jealousy and Cal's anger. They were not her children. This was not her home. It was a position of work. But as she smoothed her hair, she made a promise to the pale girl in the mirror. She would not run. She had faced down wolves, and fever, and shame. She would not abandon these children. She did not know how they would fight Silas Ward, but she knew she would be standing with them when they did. The quiet that settled over the house after Finn's fever broke was heavy and fragile. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of borrowed time. Luke's gratitude was a silent, palpable thing. He watched Evelyn, his gaze no longer assessing, but filled with a raw respect that she found almost as unnerving as his previous coldness. May, seeing her father's new regard, had retreated further into a shell of prickly silence. The truce held for 3 days. On the 4th night, Evelyn woke up, choking. The air in her small room was wrong. It was thick and sharp. It was not the familiar smell of the hearth. It was the acrid, greedy smell of burning hay. She threw off her blanket, her heart stopping, then hammering against her ribs. She looked at her tiny window. The glass was not black. It was a flickering, terrible orange. "Luke!" she screamed, her voice cracking with sleep and panic. "Fire!" She burst into the main room. He was already moving, halfway out of his bed, pulling on his boots over his long underwear. The house was illuminated by the hellish light outside. "The barn!" he yelled, his voice a roar of disbelief. The children were tumbling out of their room, their faces pale with terror. "May Cal the well," Luke commanded, his voice cutting through the panic. "Bucket brigade. Now Jonah, get B and Finn to the root cellar. Do not argue. Go!" Evelyn did not wait. She ran outside into the freezing night air, and the heat hit her like a physical blow. The hay barn, the repository of their entire winter, their feed, their survival, was an inferno. Flames licked 50 feet into the black sky, a giant roaring mouth eating their future. "The horses!" Luke yelled. He ran to the adjoining corral, where the horses were screaming and plunging against the rails, their eyes white. He threw open the gate, slapping the animals hard, driving them out onto the open prairie, away from the blaze. Evelyn reached the well. May and Cal were there, but May was frozen, her hands over her mouth, staring at the fire. "May!" Evelyn shouted, grabbing her arm and shaking her hard. "The bucket now!" The shock broke May's paralysis. She grabbed the rope, her hands fumbling. Evelyn took the other side. They hauled, the bucket impossibly heavy. Cal grabbed the first sloshing pail and ran, stumbling, throwing a meager arc of water onto the base of the inferno. It vanished in a cloud of steam. "It is no use!" Cal screamed, his voice thin with despair. "We are not saving the barn," Luke roared. He had scrambled onto the low sod roof of the house. Sparks, carried on the wind, were raining down on them. "We are saving the house, Evelyn, the roof." She understood. The wind was from the north, driving the fire straight toward them. The dry sod and timbers of their home were catching. "May, keep filling Cal. Bring them to the ladder," Evelyn ordered. She grabbed a bucket from Cal and climbed the crude ladder on the side of the house. The roof was hot. Small fires were starting all over the sod. She joined Luke, throwing her bucket of water onto a patch of smoldering grass. He was beating at another spot with a wet horse blanket, his face a mask of soot and fury. "Again!" he yelled. Evelyn scrambled down, grabbed another full bucket from Cal, and climbed back up. It was a rhythm of terror. Down the ladder, water, up the ladder, fire! Below her, May and Cal worked the well, their movements frantic and jerky. Jonah ran from the root cellar, his face streaked with tears. "Bee is screaming. She says the house is on fire." "The house is not on fire," Evelyn yelled down, her voice raw. "We are keeping it safe. Stay with her. Jonah, that is your job." She watched a spark catch the woodpile stacked against the kitchen wall. "Luke, the wall." She slid down the ladder. Grabbing a bucket, she drenched the woodpile, but the wall itself was smoking. The kitchen. She looked through the window, into the dark room, now lit by the orange glow. The ledger book. It was on the kitchen table, where Luke had been agonizing over it just that evening. Beside it, the small tin box that held the deed to the ranch, the original land grant papers from his father. If that box burned, they had no proof of ownership, no way to fight Silas Ward. "Keep the roof wet," she yelled to Luke. She burst through the kitchen door. The room was blistering hot. The air was thick. She ran to the table, grabbed the heavy ledger in one arm, and tucked the tin box under the other. They were the only things in the world that mattered besides the children. She ran back outside, clutching the evidence to her chest, just in time to see the main roof of the barn finally give way. It collapsed inward with a sound like a cannon, sending a mushroom cloud of sparks and burning debris high into the sky. "Luke!" she screamed, shielding her face. He was not on the roof. He was on the ground, running toward the lean-to attached to the barn, the place where he kept his saddles and tools. The lean-to was now catching fire. "Luke, no, it is just leather." "My father's saddle," he yelled back. He was trying to save the one thing he had not sold. He ducked inside the smoking structure. Evelyn's heart stopped. "Father!" May shrieked, dropping her bucket. He emerged a second later, coughing, his eyes streaming. He threw the heavy, floral-stamped saddle clear, followed by a wooden box of tools. He stumbled out of the doorway, gasping for air. At that exact moment, the main wall of the barn, weakened by the collapsed roof, gave way. A massive, burning timber, 12 feet long, fell outward. It seemed to hang in the air for a moment, black against the orange, and then it struck Luke across the back and shoulder. The force threw him 10 feet. He landed in the dirt and did not move. "No!" Evelyn screamed. It was a sound of pure desolation. She dropped the ledger in the box. Running to him, May was there first, throwing herself onto her father's still body. "Father, wake up, wake up!" He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He tried to push himself up with his right arm. "May, get back!" His left arm was lying at a grotesque angle, twisted uselessly at his side. My shoulder," he gasped, his face chalk white beneath the soot. "It is out, Evelyn, it is out." As May sobbed, Evelyn looked up, her gaze drawn by a sudden light in the sky. It was not the fire. High on the ridge, far away, a bright, white light shot upward, streaming sparks, a flare. Chayton. He had seen the fire. He was on the ridge, signaling Prairie's End, signaling the marshal. Help was coming, but the town was miles away. Luke was vulnerable. He was crippled by pain. A shadow detached itself from the smoke near the corral. It was Chayton. He had not been on the ridge. He had been closer. He moved with a speed that was unnerving, carrying a small bundle. He knelt beside Luke, his eyes taking in the scene. The shoulder. He did not ask. "We have to move him to the house," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. "No," Chayton said, his voice calm and absolute. "We put it back, now, before the muscles freeze." He looked directly at Evelyn. "You will do it." "Me." Her blood ran cold. I do not know how. "I will show you. He is helpless until you do." Chayton was already cutting Luke's shirt sleeve away with a knife. The joint was a swollen, misshapen lump. "You are strong enough. Brace your foot here." He positioned Evelyn's boot against Luke's ribs. "Hold his wrist, tightly." Evelyn looked at Luke. His eyes were squeezed shut, his teeth grinding. "Luke," she said, her own voice trembling. This is going to hurt." "Just do it," he bit out, a single, agonizing word. "Pull," Chayton commanded. "Pull steady and lean back." Evelyn pulled. Her boot braced. The resistance was terrible. Luke roared, a deep, animal sound. "It is not moving," she cried. "Turn the arm," Chayton said, his voice level. "Outward, now, hard." Evelyn shut her eyes and twisted. Using all her weight, she felt a sickening wet pop, a heavy shifting of bone and gristle. Luke's scream tore through the night, louder than the fire. Then he went limp, his body collapsing, though he was still conscious, gasping. "It is done," Chayton said. He was already pulling a strip of cloth from his bundle, fashioning a sling, immobilizing the arm against Luke's chest. At that moment, they heard it, the rattle of wagons, hoofbeats. The flare had worked. Headlights cut through the smoke. Mr. Henderson from the store, the blacksmith, and 2 other ranchers. Behind them, holding a lantern high, was Marshall Brody. Dawn was a gray, filthy smear in the east. The barn was gone. It was a smoking, hissing rectangle of black ruin. The house was saved, its western wall scorched black, the woodpile a pile of ash. The neighbors, having done what they could, had watered down the last of the embers and left, their faces grim. Luke sat on the porch steps, his left arm bound tightly in the sling. His face was gray with pain and exhaustion. The 5 children were huddled together under a single blanket, staring at the ruin. Evelyn stood, numb, still clutching the tin box. She had saved the papers. They had lost the winter. They had no feed. They had no money. They were, in every practical sense, finished. Marshall Brody was walking the perimeter of the smoking rubble, his notebook in hand. "It was arson, Marshall," Luke said, his voice flat. "That is a heavy claim." "Luke," the marshal said, not looking up. "The wind was high. A spark from your own chimney could have done this." "I have no enemies," Luke said, "except one." "You cannot prove it." Evelyn walked toward the back of the barn, near where the fire had started. The ground was wet and churned from the horses and the firefighting. But in one spot, sheltered by the heavy iron water trough, the mud was undisturbed. She saw them. "Marshall," she called, her voice sharp, cutting. The marshal and Chayton walked over. Evelyn pointed. In the mud were horseshoe prints, but one was backward. The crescents were facing the wrong way. Chayton knelt. "I have seen this, a rustler's trick, to confuse a tracker." He looked up at the marshal. "The men who ride for Silas Ward, one of them shot his horse this way." "That is thin, Chayton," the marshal said, rubbing his jaw. "A man can shoe a horse any way he likes." "Then look at this," Evelyn said. Her voice was shaking, but with rage, not fear. She pointed to a deep boot print, pressed into the mud right beside the hoof mark. It was a large boot. In the heel, 3 hobnails had been hammered in a distinct triangle pattern. "I saw that boot,"
Evelyn said, her mind flashing back to the general store, to the saloon. The day I arrived, one of the men laughing about me, he was tracking in mud. He had those nails in his heel. I remember it.
The marshal knelt. Studying the print, he sketched it in his notebook. It is a boot. It is not Silas Ward. It is his hired man. Evelyn insisted. Before the marshal could answer, a new sound interrupted them. A fine, black carriage, pulled by two matching black horses, was pulling into the yard. It was not from Prairie's End. This carriage was from Cheyenne. A man in a dark, expensive suit and a city hat stepped out. He was not Silas Ward. He was older, with a face like dried leather. He carried a fine leather satchel. He looked at the smoking ruins with distaste, then at Luke. Mr. Luke McCrae. His voice was thin and precise. "I am him," Luke said, getting to his feet, his good hand clenched. "I am Barrister Thompson, representing the railroad and land company. I am here to serve you this." He handed Luke a folded piece of paper. Luke stared at it, his face uncomprehending. "It is a notice of injunction," the lawyer said, his voice cold. "You are hereby ordered to cease and desist diverting water from the spring at the head of this valley. According to the revised county survey, you are trespassing on company land."
"Diverting," Luke's voice was hoarse. "That is a natural stream. It has always flowed through my land."
"A stream you have illegally dammed for your cattle, Mr. McCrae, a dam which sits squarely on property owned by my clients."
"That dam is sod," Luke spat. "It has been there for 20 years.
"It is an illegal structure. Furthermore," the lawyer continued, his eyes sweeping over the devastated yard, "given your clear financial distress, your delinquent taxes, and this obvious hazard, the company is petitioning the county to seize this property and put it to auction." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We are, however, authorized to make one final, generous offer, $500 for your entire claim. It will settle your tax account and leave you enough to move your children." It was a perfectly timed, brutal execution. They had burned him out and were now using the fire as leverage to take his land for pennies.
"You,"
Luke started, taking a step, but Chayton put a hand on his good shoulder. "You cannot," Evelyn said, stepping forward. She was still holding the ledger and the tin box. The lawyer looked at her, a flicker of annoyance in his cold eyes.
"Miss, you cannot seize it. You burned us out, and now you—"
"Evelyn," Luke warned.
"I will not be quiet," she said, turning to the marshal. "He burned us out. Marshal, his man left those prints, and now he sends this vulture."
"Those are dangerous accusations, young lady," the lawyer said. "And this is a dangerous man," Marshal Brody said, stepping between them. He looked at the lawyer. "Barrister, I do not know how you do things in Cheyenne, but in this county, we do not serve injunctions while a man's barn is still smoking, especially when that fire looks like arson."
"The injunction is immediate,"
Thompson insisted. "And the hearing," the marshal said, his voice hard, "will be held by the town council, as is our right. They will hear the water dispute. They will hear the tax dispute, and I will be presenting my findings on this fire in 5 days. The lawyer's thin lips tightened. He had wanted a clean, immediate surrender. He was getting a public fight. 5 days. The lawyer sniffed, as if the word stained his mouth. "Very well, Marshal, the law will wait 5 days, but it will not wait any longer. Good day, Mr. McCrae." He climbed back into his fine carriage and rolled away, leaving the injunction notice sitting in the dirt. Evelyn looked at Luke. He was staring at the ruin of his barn. They had 5 days. 5 days to find a way to fight a railroad company with no money, no winter feed, and a body broken by the fire. The battle had finally, truly, begun. The 4 days following the fire were a blur of cold, aching work. The ruin of the barn smoked and hissed, a black, gap-toothed wound in the yard. Luke, his left arm bound tightly to his chest, was a silent, one-armed engine of fury. He worked with a grim persistence, salvaged blackened tools, and tried, awkwardly, to patch the scorched western wall of the house. His pain was constant, radiating from his shoulder, but he refused to stop. Evelyn, meanwhile, held the house together. She managed the terrified children. She stretched their meager, smoke-tainted provisions. And she held the ledger and the tin box like a shield. The evidence. "It is not enough, Evelyn," Luke said on the third night. His voice was rough with exhaustion. He sat at the table, staring at the injunction notice. "The boot print. The marshal cannot arrest a man for his boot. And the stone—" He shook his head. "That Cheyenne lawyer will laugh it out of the church." "It is the truth," Evelyn insisted, her voice stubborn. "Chayton said it was a law." "It is not their law." "Then we need more," she said. She looked at him, her mind racing. "Luke, the spring, your father, you said the dam was 20 years old. Did he file the claim? Was there anyone else who knew?" Luke was silent for a long time, his good hand rubbing his beard. "My father, he did not trust banks. He did not trust lawyers. He trusted the land, and he trusted Hemlock. The blacksmith. Old man Hemlock. He made the brands for my father's herd. He came out. I was a boy. I remember him. At the spring, he was doing something. He and my father argued for a week about it. Hemlock is a bitter old man. He hates everyone. He will not help us." "He might hate Silas Ward more," Evelyn said. "We have to go. We have to be at the hearing." On the morning of the 5th day, the world had changed. The sky was a low, bruised, yellowish gray. The wind had died, and the silence was heavy, unnatural. "A blizzard," Luke said, standing on the porch, his collar high. "A bad one. It is early." "We cannot wait," Evelyn said. "The hearing is at noon. If we are not there, we forfeit. They will take the spring." "And the children?" he asked, his voice raw. "We cannot leave them, not in this, not with that wall." The scorched wall was a gaping vulnerability. "We all go," Evelyn said, her decision as hard as the frozen ground. "We all go. If we lose the ranch, we lose it together. May, Cal, get the blankets, all of them. Jonah, find Finn's boots." As they were loading the one remaining buckboard, Chayton appeared. He rode in not as a ghost, but as a solid, grim presence. He was leading 2 extra horses. "The wind will turn," he said, looking at the sky. "It will come from the north. It will be white and fast. You will not make it in the wagon." "We have to," Luke said. "Then we ride hard," Chayton said. He looked at the children, his gaze lingering on Bee and Finn. He tied the wagon's mules to the back and his own horses to the side. "We take the wagon, but we must leave now." They piled in. Evelyn sat beside Luke on the hard bench, the tin box and the ledger at her feet, a large piece of oilcloth wrapped around them. In her pocket, she had a piece of charcoal and a rolled sheet of clean muslin. She had gone back to the draw with Chayton the day before. She had made a rubbing of the stone marker, a faint, dark shadow of the truth. The children huddled in the back, buried under a pile of buffalo robes and blankets. Chayton rode ahead, his body silhouetted against the sick yellow sky. The snow began an hour later. It was not a gentle flurry. It was an instant, blinding wall of white. The wind did not rise, it exploded. It screamed, a high-pitched, maddening sound that drove ice needles horizontally into their faces. The world vanished. There was no sky, no land, only the churning, suffocating white. The mules brayed, terrified, and began to balk. The wagon wheels, clogged with heavy, wet snow, locked up. "It is too deep," Luke yelled over the roar, his one good hand fighting the reins. Chayton's horse appeared beside them, a phantom in the storm. We must leave the wagon. We cannot make the town. The mules will founder and die.
Where?
Evelyn screamed, her voice torn away.
There is nothing.
The old ranger station, Chayton yelled back, pointing into the white nothingness. It is 2 miles north. We will drift if we stay. It was a death sentence. To leave the wagon was to abandon their only way home. To stay was to freeze. We go, Luke commanded. He grabbed his rifle. Chayton dismounted, his movements economical. He uncoiled the lariat from his saddle. He tied one end around his own waist. We make a chain, he ordered. He passed the rope to Luke, who fumbled to tie it with his one good hand. Evelyn helped him. He tied the rope around Luke. Then Evelyn, then May, then Cal.
Jonah, hold my coat,
Evelyn shouted. She pulled Finn from the blankets, his small body already shivering. She buttoned him inside her own heavy coat, a small, warm lump against her chest. Luke, his face a mask of pain, lifted Bee with his good arm.
Follow me,
Chayton ordered. Do not let go of the rope. He began to walk, leading his horse, his body leaning into the wind. They stepped from the wagon into a world of pure, screaming chaos. The snow was already past their knees. It was not walking, it was wallowing. They marched for what felt like eternity. Evelyn's legs burned. The wind stole her breath. She could see nothing but Luke's back, a dark shape 2 feet in front of her. Finn was a dead weight, his small, muffled sobs vibrating against her ribs. Bee, in Luke's arm, began to cough. It was not a child's cough. It was a tight, dry, high-pitched wheeze.
Luke,
Evelyn shouted.
Luke, she cannot breathe.
Luke stopped, turning. Bee's face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. She was gasping, pulling for air that would not come.
Her asthma.
Luke gasped, panic in his eyes.
The cold. Mary had a tea. I do not.
There is shelter, Chayton's voice came back, faint. 50 yards. He half-dragged them the last distance. The ranger station was barely a shack, a single sodden timber room, one window boarded over, the door hanging on one hinge. But it had 4 walls and a stone fireplace. They fell inside, collapsing onto the frozen dirt floor, a tangle of bodies and rope. Chayton and Cal fought the door shut, barring it with a piece of fallen timber. The roar of the wind was muffled, but the cold was still deadly.
Fire,
Chayton said.
Cal, the kindling bag from my saddle.
Luke was kneeling, trying to rub Bee's back.
She is closing up. Evelyn, God, she is closing up.
Evelyn looked around, frantic. She was shaking, her own lungs aching. Her eyes fell on her small satchel, the one she had grabbed from the wagon. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was the small, dried bundle of herbs Chayton had given her for Finn's fever. Mullein and sage.
Luke, your knife,
she demanded. He fumbled it from his belt. She looked at the wood Cal had brought in. She grabbed a small, hollow branch, no thicker than her thumb. With deft, desperate movements, she carved holes in the side, turning it into a small, crude tube. Chayton, a hot coal, from the flint, now. While Chayton struck a spark into the tinder, Evelyn crumbled the dry, sharp-smelling herbs into the hollow stick.
Bee,
she said, pulling the girl into her lap.
Bee, listen to me.
Chayton brought a single, glowing coal on the tip of his knife. Evelyn dropped it onto the herbs. They smoldered, releasing a thick, pungent, piney smoke.
Breathe this,
Evelyn commanded. She put the tube to Bee's lips. Breathe the smoke. It is like the singing storm. Breathe. Bee choked, her small body convulsing. Then she inhaled, a ragged, smoky, desperate gasp. The smoke filled her lungs. She coughed, a deep, rattling sound. And then she inhaled again. The awful, high-pitched whistle in her chest began to ease. The blue tinge left her lips. She was breathing. It was ragged, but she was breathing. Evelyn rocked her, her own body shaking with the aftershock of her desperate, dangerous gamble. She had improvised an inhaler from a stick, herbs, and a hot coal. She looked up. Luke was watching her, his face a wreck of terror, gratitude, and awe. Night fell. The storm did not lessen. It intensified. The shack vibrated. They were trapped. "Noon," Luke said, his voice dead. He was slumped against the wall, his bad arm cradled in his lap. "The hearing was at noon. We have missed it. It is over." "We are alive," Evelyn said quietly. The children were asleep, a pile of limbs and blankets as close to the small, sputtering fire as they could get. Chayton sat by the door, a silent guardian, his spear across his knees, listening to the wind. The fire was dying. The cold was a physical, creeping thing. We should move the children closer," Evelyn said, her teeth chattering. "They are as close as they can be," Luke said. He looked at her. She was shivering violently, her thin coat no match for the cold. "Come here," he said, his voice rough. She looked at him, confused. "Come here," he repeated, moving the single blanket that covered his legs. We must share the warmth. For the children. We cannot freeze." She hesitated. This was her master, the man who had set the terms. "Evelyn," he said, and the roughness was gone, replaced by a simple, desperate plea. "Please." She moved, sitting beside him, her back against the cold sod wall. He draped the heavy wool blanket over both of them, tucking it tightly around her shoulders with his one good hand. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the storm and the breathing of the 5 children. The meager warmth from his body seeped into hers. "You saved her," he whispered, his voice so low she barely heard it. "Like you saved Finn. I have never seen anything like that. The stick, the smoke." "I was terrified," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "I thought I might harm her." "But you did not," he said. "You did not hesitate. You did not run after the fire. You did not run from the wolves. You did not run from May." He let out a long, pained breath. "Any other woman would have been gone. I would not have blamed her." "This is my home," Evelyn whispered, the words surprising her. "I told you, I have a say in the safety of this house, of these children." He turned his head in the dim, flickering light. He was close. She could smell the smoke on his clothes, the clean, sharp scent of the cold. His face was streaked with soot and exhaustion, but his eyes were clear, and they were looking at her in a way no one ever had. "Evelyn," he said, his voice thick. His good arm, his right arm, came up. His hand was huge, the knuckles scarred, the calluses like leather. It was trembling. He touched her face, his thumb gently brushing the ice from her eyelashes. It was a touch that asked, not took. He leaned in, his movement slow, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. He kissed her. It was not the fiery, demanding kiss she had read about in forbidden penny dreadfuls. It was a kiss of profound, desperate gratitude. It was slow and chaste, and tasted of wood smoke, ice, and a shared, unbreakable hope. It was a promise of warmth in a dying world. It lasted only a moment, but it changed everything. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers for a second. She was trembling, but not from the cold. "Luke," she breathed. He understood the question in her voice. He, a widower of 35. She, a virgin of 19. He pulled away slightly, his eyes holding hers, his expression full of a sudden, fierce respect. "We do this in the right order," he said, his voice low and steady, a vow in the darkness. "We save the house, we raise the children. The rest can wait. It can wait for its proper time."
He was not her master. He was her partner. The storm broke before dawn. The world was silent, 6 feet deep in a blinding, unbroken white. "It is 10 miles to town," Luke said, his voice dead again. "We will never make it." "We will," Chayton said. He was at the door, pulling it open. He held his spear. He probed the snow, testing its depth, finding the solid ground beneath the drifts. "I will make the path." It was a brutal, agonizing march. Chayton went first, his lean body acting as a human snowplow. Luke, Evelyn, and the older children followed in his narrow trough, the snow still waist-high. They took turns carrying Finn and Bee. They reached Prairie's End as the church bell was ringing. Evelyn paused, exhausted, her heart sinking. She counted 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. It was noon. They were too late. "No," Cal gasped, pointing. "Look." The bell was still ringing. It rang a 13th time. "It is not the hour." Chayton said, "It is a summons, the hearing. They waited." They ran, stumbling, a ragged group of ghosts covered in snow and ice. They burst through the main doors of the church. It was packed. The entire town was there. At the front, at a long table, sat Pastor Davies, Marshal Brody, and a county commissioner. Silas Ward was there, clean, warm, and smiling, his Cheyenne lawyer beside him. "Mr. McCrae," Marshal Brody said, his voice booming, "you are an hour late." "We were trapped," Luke gasped, leaning on the back of a pew. "The blizzard. At the old station." "The deadline was noon," the lawyer said, standing up, his voice smooth. "The storm is unfortunate, but irrelevant. We move for summary judgment on the injunction, and," he smiled, "we have witnesses." A man Evelyn recognized from the saloon stood up. "I saw him," the man said, pointing at Luke. "I saw Mr. McCrae build that dam last summer. He diverted the water, stole it." "That is a lie," Evelyn cried, stepping forward. "And you are Miss," the lawyer sneered. "I am Evelyn Hart, and that man is lying." She fumbled in her satchel, pulling out the oilcloth. She unrolled the muslin, the charcoal rubbing. "This is the proof. This is the old marker, the Lakota marker. It proves the spring is common." The lawyer laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A child's drawing, a smudge of charcoal. That is your legal defense. The court dismisses this nonsense." "It is not nonsense," a new voice boomed, cutting through the laughter. The crowd parted. Old Man Hemlock, the blacksmith, stomped down the aisle. He was ancient, his beard singed gray, his arms like knotted oak. He was carrying a heavy, rusted, flat piece of steel. "The lawyer is a fool," Hemlock growled, his voice like grinding metal. "And the girl is right." He slammed the steel plate onto the table in front of the council. 20 years ago, Hemlock said, glaring at Silas Ward. "Luke's father, a good man, had me make this. He wanted no disputes. He respected the old ways." He pointed to the steel. It was a template, a perfect, exact, line-for-line match of the Lakota carving on Evelyn's cloth. "I hammered this marker into the stone myself," Hemlock said. "With Luke's father and a Lakota elder. It marks the spring as community water, as per the original treaty. And I, sir," he said, turning to the lawyer, "filed a copy of the deed, with this very map etched onto it, at the county seat in Cheyenne, 20 years ago, before your railroad was even a dirty rumor." Silas Ward's smile was gone. His face was the color of snow. The lawyer was speechless. The legal, filed deed matched the ancient stone law. The day was over. The hearing was adjourned for a final verdict. They were exhausted, snow-caked, but alive. The townspeople, who had mocked them, now watched them with a new, grudging respect.
As they walked to the marshal's office to get warm, Luke stopped Evelyn by the church door, away from the children. His bad arm was throbbing, but his eyes were blazing with a fire she had not seen before. He touched her hand, her frozen, chapped hand. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and hoarse. After this is all done, if that house still has a roof, I am going to ask you, in the proper way." She met his gaze, her heart so full it ached. She did not speak, she just nodded. Once, it was enough. The church was not a holy place that day. It was a courtroom, and the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, old smoke, and a tension so sharp it was almost a sound. The light from the tall, narrow windows was gray and unforgiving, illuminating the exhausted, snow-caked faces of the McCrae family in the front pew and the pale, rigid face of Silas Ward near the aisle. At the front, where the altar should have been, sat the counsel, Pastor Davies, his face drawn and pale, sat in the center. He had been shamed by Hemlock's testimony, his complicity with the railroad money now a visible burden. Marshal Brody sat to his right, his face impassive, his notebook open. To the left was the county commissioner, a stern-faced man named Elias Thorne, who had arrived from Cheyenne just for this. He represented the final, binding law. Barrister Thompson, Silas Ward's lawyer, was on his feet, his professional calm shattered. He was sputtering. This is an outrage," he declared, his voice too high. "A piece of rusted steel, a faded drawing by a girl. You cannot dismiss a legal, modern survey based on folklore." Commissioner Thorne leaned forward. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the lawyers. "Mr. Hemlock," he said, addressing the blacksmith, "you stated you filed a copy of this steel map with the county deed 20 years ago." "I did," Hemlock growled. "Luke's father and I rode to Cheyenne ourselves, paid the $2 filing fee." The lawyer scoffed. "A convenient memory, old man." "It is not a memory, you fool," Marshal Brody said, his voice a flat rumble. "After Mr. Hemlock informed me of this possibility, I telegraphed the county records office this morning. They confirmed. The deed to Broken Mesa Ranch, filed in 1866, includes a hand-etched addendum matching this plate exactly. It is legal, it is binding, and it predates your railroad's charter by a decade." A gasp went through the crowd. Silas Ward gripped the edge of the pew, his knuckles white. "The survey is invalid," Commissioner Thorne stated. He looked at the lawyer. "Your case for the injunction, based on a faulty survey, is dismissed." "But the diversion," the lawyer stammered, scrambling. "The illegal dam, our witness testified." "Your witness," Marshal Brody said, "is a known drunk who owes Mr. Ward $50, according to his tab at the saloon. I demand to call my witness back." "He is unavailable," Brody said. "He is currently in my jail cell, sleeping it off." "This is a mockery of the law." "No," a quiet voice said. Evelyn Hart stood up. She was still holding the oilcloth bundle. Her clothes were damp, her face streaked with soot from the fire, but her back was straight. "This is not a mockery," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the silent church. "It is the truth." The lawyer turned on her, his eyes full of contempt. "You, the girl, you have no standing here. You are not a McCrae. You are not a landowner. You are—" "What?" "A housekeeper." Evelyn felt the blood rush to her face, the familiar sting of shame. She looked at Luke. He was watching her, his one good hand clenched, his eyes burning with a silent, supportive fire. He nodded at her. "Speak." She turned back to the lawyer, and the shame was gone, replaced by a cold, clear anger. "I am Evelyn Hart," she said, her voice stronger now. "And I am a witness. You say we have no proof. You say our claim is folklore, but our proof is a chain, and it is stronger than your paper. She stepped forward into the aisle. Walking toward the council, she unrolled the muslin, the dark charcoal rubbing of the stone. This, she said, holding it up, is the first link, the law of the land, carved in stone. It is the Lakota marker. It shows the spring, and it shows the lines of sharing. It is the first law. It was here before any of us. The lawyer rolled his eyes, but Commissioner Thorne was leaning forward, studying the rubbing. And this, Evelyn said, touching the heavy steel plate Hemlock had brought, is the second link, the promise of the community. Mr. Hemlock made this and Luke's father signed it. They made the law of the stone into the law of the forge. They respected the first law. She then walked back to the pew and retrieved the tin box she had saved from the fire. She placed it on the table with a solid, definitive sound. And this, she said, her voice ringing with conviction, is the third link. This is the deed to Broken Mesa Ranch, the paper you claim to respect, the paper I pulled from a burning wall. And, as the marshal has confirmed, it contains the map, the stone, the steel, and the paper. They all say the same thing. The water is common. The spring belongs to this valley. She looked at Pastor Davies, her gaze direct and unflinching. This is not folklore. Barrister, this is history. This is fact. And this is the law. She finished, her heart pounding, and stepped back. A profound silence filled the church. Commissioner Thorne looked at Chayton, who had been standing silently near the back wall. Mr. Chayton, Thorne said, his voice respectful, you are Lakota. You live by this water. What is your testimony? Chayton moved. He did not walk down the aisle. He seemed to glide, moving to the center of the church, standing between the council and the town. He was not dressed for a hearing. He was dressed for the land, in wool and hide. He did not look at the lawyer or the council. He looked at the people, at the ranchers, the store owners, the wives. I do not know your paper law, he began, his voice quiet, yet it filled every corner. I know the law of the land. The man in the fine suit, he gestured toward. He sees the spring as a thing to own, a line on a map, to sell. He shook his head. The spring is not a thing. It is a life. It is the blood of the earth. It feeds the roots of the cottonwood. It feeds the deer. It fed the bison, who gave us our lives. Now it feeds your cattle. It feeds your children. It feeds this town. His dark eyes moved over the crowd, landing on one rancher, then another. You all drink from this water. When the drought came 3 summers ago, your own wells went dry. You came to the Broken Mesa Spring. Luke's father did not turn you away. He did not ask for paper. He did not ask for money. He shared the water, as the stone law commands. He looked at Pastor Davies. Your book speaks of a shepherd, of living water. The railroad wants to put a fence around this water, to build a trough and charge for every drink. The spring is life, and life cannot be owned by one man. It can only be shared, or it dies. And so do we. He finished. There was no applause. There was only the sound of men shifting in their seats, of women quietly weeping. He had not made a legal argument. He had delivered a verdict on their souls. Silas Ward could see the water was lost. He leaned in and whispered to his lawyer. The council finds for the people, Commissioner Thorne declared, his voice firm. But this hearing is not over. Marshal Brody stood up, holding his notebook. He looked at Silas Ward. Mr. Ward, he said, his voice booming like the blacksmith's hammer. We have settled the matter of the water. Now we turn to the matter of the fire. Silas Ward paled, but his lawyer jumped up. This is preposterous. The fire was a tragic accident, a spark from the chimney. Was it? Brody said. I found 2 sets of tracks by the burned barn. One, he looked at Chayton, was shod backward, a rustler's trick. The other was a boot print, a large boot, with 3 hobnails, hammered in a triangle in the heel. He held up the sketch he had made in the mud. Circumstantial, the lawyer shouted. Is it? Brody replied, his voice dangerously calm. Because while you were all waiting out the storm, my deputy, acting on my orders, paid a visit to the bunkhouse of the Railroad and Land Company. He was looking for a man named Jeb Carter, a man known to ride a horse with a backward shoe, a man who favors a triangle pattern in his boot heels.
Silas Ward was no longer moving. He was a statue of ice.
Mr. Carter was not there. Brody continued, but my deputy found these. He reached into his coat and threw a heavy canvas bag onto the council table. It landed with a heavy clink. Kerosene-soaked rags and a box of hobnails, matching the print exactly.
The lawyer was speechless.
But it gets better, Brody said, a grim satisfaction on his face. We found Mr. Jeb Carter at the saloon. He was drunk. He was celebrating. He was bragging, very loudly, about how he had warmed up the McCrae place. He said, and here Brody's voice dropped, that his boss paid him $50 to run the widower and his brats out for good. This is slander, Ward roared, finding his voice. A drunk's lies. Mr. Carter, Brody said, provided a full, signed confession in exchange for a lighter sentence for arson. He named you Mr. Ward. He said you gave him the money, you gave him the kerosene, and you told him to burn them out before the hearing. The church exploded. Men were on their feet, shouting, "Liar! Arsonist! Villain!" Pastor Davies banged his gavel, his face white with rage and shame. Order, order in the house of God. Commissioner Thorne stood up, his face a mask of cold fury. He raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. This council finds as follows, he declared, his voice echoing in the rafters. 1. The injunction is denied. The survey map filed by the Railroad and Land Company is declared invalid. The spring at Broken Mesa is, and will remain, community water. A cheer went up. Thorne raised his hand again. 2. In accordance with the spirit of the original treaty, the guardianship of this spring, its maintenance, and its fair use for all members of this community, is hereby affirmed to the owners and residents of the Broken Mesa Ranch. Luke closed his eyes, his one good hand finding Evelyn's. 3. The Railroad and Land Company will cease all operations in this valley. They will redraw their route, respecting all community water rights. They will. And here he stared at the lawyer. Renegotiate their entire charter, in good faith with this council, and with the full oversight of the county. 4, he said, his voice turning to ice. Mr. Silas Ward, you are under arrest by the authority of the United States Marshal's Office on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, intimidation, and arson. As Marshal Brody put a heavy hand on Silas Ward's shoulder, the church fell silent again. The victory was so sudden, so total, it was stunning. Finn, who had been asleep in Jonah's lap, woke up at the sudden silence. He looked around at the grim faces, then at Evelyn and Luke. He giggled, a small, happy, silvery sound that broke the terrible tension. It was too much for May, the 11-year-old girl, who had been a fortress of anger and grief for months, finally broke. She had watched Evelyn stand up to the lawyer. She had heard her save their home, her face, pale and streaked with dirt, crumpled. She did not go to her father. She turned, launched herself off the pew, and threw her arms around Evelyn's waist. She buried her face in Evelyn's cold, damp coat, her small body shaking with sobs. "You stayed," May cried, her voice muffled. "You saved it! You saved our home! You stayed!" Evelyn, stunned, looked down at the top of the girl's head. Her arms, aching with cold, came up and held May tightly. She stroked her hair, tears streaming silently down her own face. Luke watched them, his hard face breaking. This was the victory. Not the land, not the water. This. He walked over, the entire town watching. He stood in front of them, this strange, broken, snow-covered family. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes full of a love and respect so profound it hurt to see. And then, in front of God, in front of the town that had gossiped about them, in front of his 5 children, Luke McCrae did what he had promised. He bent his stiff, aching body. He dropped to one knee. A collective gasp went through the church. "Evelyn Hart," he said, his voice raw, but it carried to every corner. He was not a man of easy words, but he spoke them now, as if they were a creed. "You saved my son. You saved my daughter. You saved my house. And today, you saved my land. You have been the guardian of my children. You have been my partner." He took her free hand, the one that was not holding May. "I am asking you," he said, "in the proper way, the way this should have been done from the start. Will you stay? Not as my housekeeper. Will you stay as my wife? Will you be their mother?" Evelyn was crying, but she was smiling. She looked from Luke's upturned, earnest face to May clinging to her, to Cal, Jonah, and Bee, who were all watching, their eyes wide with a new, sudden hope. She could not speak. She just nodded, her chin moving up and down. "Yes," she whispered, a word just for him. "Yes." The church did not cheer. It was too holy a moment. But as Luke rose, his good arm pulling Evelyn and May into a single, tight embrace, the community, which had been a thing of sharp edges and cruel whispers, dissolved. Mistress Davies, the pastor's wife, was the first to move, her own face wet with tears. "You are all frozen," she declared, her voice full of a new, fierce purpose. "You are coming to the parsonage. All of you. There is hot stew." Old man Hemlock clapped Luke on his good shoulder. "McCrae, you fought well, boy. I will be at your ranch tomorrow. With my tools, we are rebuilding that barn." Mr. Henderson, the store owner, pushed through. "Luke, the feed you lost, it is replaced. Consider it a community debt, paid in full." The women who had whispered about the 19-year-old girl now surrounded Evelyn, one of them wrapping a dry, warm blanket around her shoulders, another taking a sleepy fin from Jonah's arms. The men who had bet on how long she would last were now patting Luke's back, offering lumber and hay and help. They had walked into the church as outcasts. They walked out, carried on a wave of love and respect, as a family. The return to Broken Mesa Ranch was slow, the journey back through the deep snowdrifts taking twice as long as the desperate race to town. But the wagon they rode in was not the one they had abandoned. It was Mr. Henderson's heavy freight wagon, pulled by 4 strong mules, and its bed was not empty. It was loaded with planks of fresh-cut pine, sacks of feed, a quarter side of beef, and smoked hams, all donated by the town. They arrived at the ranch to find a miracle. Old man Hemlock had been true to his word. He was already there, along with 3 other ranchers. The smoking, black ruin of the barn was being cleared. The men were laughing, their breath pluming in the cold air, as they heaved charred timbers out of the way. The house, which had felt like a cold, empty box of despair after the fire, was now full of life. Mistress Davies had come with 2 other ranch wives. They had stoked the fire until the main room was blissfully warm. They had scrubbed the soot from the kitchen walls, aired out the smoke-tainted blankets, and a massive pot of venison stew, thick with barley and carrots, was bubbling over the hearth. It was the smell of safety. It was the smell of home. That first dinner, after the blizzard and the fire and the trial, was a strange and holy thing. It was not just the 7 of them. The long table was crowded. Hemlock, Mistress Davies, and the other ranchers who had helped all sat down. They ate from mismatched bowls and plates, their knees knocking under the table. Finn sat in Luke's lap, his face smeared with gravy, happily asleep before the meal was even over. Luke, his left arm bound tightly, raised a tin cup of water with his right. He looked at Hemlock. He looked at Mistress Davies. He looked at the faces of his neighbors. I do not have the words," he said, his voice thick. My house, it stands. My children, they are warm. He paused, and his gaze found Evelyn, who sat across from him, her own face flushed from the heat of the fire. We stand because of all of you. You would do the same. Luke, Hemlock grunted, tearing a piece of bread. That is what community means. It means you are not alone in the wind. In the days that followed, the ranch was a hive of activity. The men, led by Hemlock's booming, profane commands, set the new roof beams for the barn. They rebuilt the scorched water trough, its wood ringing with the sound of hammers. The women, led by Evelyn, insulated the new structure with bales of fresh straw donated from the neighboring ranches, their chatter and laughter a new and welcome sound. Inside the house, a new order was taking root. The terror of the fire and the trial had forged a new family. But Evelyn knew that families were not built on grand moments. They were built on small, daily rules. One evening, after the neighbors had gone, she and Luke sat at the table. The ledger, once a symbol of debt, was now open to a clean page. We need rules, Evelyn said quietly, dipping a pen in a small pot of ink. Hearth rules. Luke looked at her, his expression soft in the lamplight. Rules, he agreed. Cal, she said, looking at the 10-year-old boy, who was whittling again. Your shavings, you will sweep them every night, or you will lose the knife for a day. Cal looked up, his instinct to rebel rising, but he met his father's steady gaze, and then Evelyn's. He nodded. Once. Yes, ma'am. May, Evelyn continued, her voice gentle. You are the eldest. You will oversee the water. You and Cal will take turns hauling the wood in the water buckets. One day for you, one for him, without argument. May, who only a week before would have met this with a storm of silent fury, now looked relieved. She had a job, a defined, important place. I can do that, she said. Jonah, Evelyn said. Your numbers. You will help me with the larder. You will count the sacks and the cans. You will be the keeper of the supplies. Jonah beamed. Bee and Finn, she finished. We'll dry the tin plates after supper, and every night, from 7 o'clock until 8 o'clock. There is no whittling, no sewing. We read, May will read aloud. Cal will practice his letters. We will be a house that reads. Luke watched her, his heart so full it ached. She was not just a housekeeper. She was not just a wife-to-be. She was a founder. She was with him, building a civilization in this small sod house. That night, after the children were asleep, the two of them sat by the fire, the silence comfortable, no longer strained. She is Mary, Luke began, his voice low and halting. She was a good woman, a kind woman, but she was not like you. She was not strong. The land, it frightened her. The wind, the children. Evelyn waited, knowing this was a confession he needed to make, a ghost that needed to be laid to rest. When she got the fever, he whispered, staring into the flames. I was helpless. I brought the doctor. I prayed. But I felt useless. I could not fight it. I could not stop it. I am a man who knows how to fix fences, how to break a horse, how to fight. But I could not fight a fever. And when she died, I felt like I had failed, like I had let her go. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes raw with the memory. But you fought it. With Finn, you fought the fever with herbs and nerve. You fought the wolves with my wife's rifle. You fought the blizzard with a stick and smoke. You fought that lawyer with your words. You are not helpless. I have never met anyone less helpless. I was not helpless, Evelyn said, her own voice quiet. Because I had nothing to lose. Not like you. What do you mean? When I was at the orphanage, she said, the words tasting strange. Words she had never spoken aloud. We were We were like objects. We were pieces to be moved. We had no say. We were fed. We were clothed. But we were not part of anything. I dreamed. It was a silly dream. I dreamed of a table, a big table, with too many chairs, and all the chairs were full, and everyone was arguing over the last piece of bread, and laughing. I did not dream of a husband, or a white dress. I dreamed of a full table. She looked at him, her smile small and sad. My entire life, I have been fighting to not be alone. When I came here, I was just fighting for survival, but then there was May, and Cal, and Finn, with his fever, and you, in the fire. She touched the tin box, which now sat on the mantel. I ran into that fire for the papers, Luke, but I would have run into it for any one of you. I was not just fighting for my own survival anymore. I was fighting for my family, for my full table. Luke's good hand found hers, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. It is full, Evelyn, he said, his voice thick. It will always be full. A few days later, as the new barn roof was being timbered, Chayton came. He sat on his horse, watching the work, a rare, small smile on his face. He had come to say goodbye. The snow is deep, he said, but the river is opening. I must return. You will be back, Luke asked. The land is quiet now. Chayton said, the man with the greedy eyes is gone, but the river will always need watching. He looked at Evelyn. He dismounted and untied a package from his saddle. It was a belt. It was made of thick, oiled leather, and it was beautiful. Carved deep into its entire length was a single, repeating, intricate pattern of rolling waves. For the one who guards the house, he said, handing it to her. Evelyn took it, her fingers tracing the deep, flowing lines. It is the river. It is the water, Chayton said. It is the law of the stone. Your house stands, Evelyn Hart. It stands because it stood together, like the water. It was stronger than the rock that tried to stop it. He mounted his horse. He looked at Luke. You have a good woman, Luke McCrae. She has the heart of a Lakota. He gave a single nod and was gone, a silent shape disappearing against the white snow. The next week, the thaw came in earnest, and with it, finality. A rider from Cheyenne brought a packet. Inside was a crisp new document from the county commissioner. It affirmed, in ironclad legal language, the community water rights of the spring, and named Luke McCrae its legal guardian. Tucked inside was another letter, the county tax board. In light of the community testimony and the criminal actions of the railroad and land company, had deferred his tax bill for 1 full year, interest-free. And with that news came a gift. The ranchers, organized by Mr. Henderson, had pooled their money. It was not charity. They insisted it was a community fund. They had purchased 6 head of healthy, hardy cattle from a ranch in the next county to replace what Luke had lost to sickness and the fire. Broken Mesa Ranch was solvent. With the security of their future, May began to change. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, intense seriousness. She watched Evelyn, shadowing her, helping with the mending, with the cooking. One afternoon, she approached Evelyn alone. Evelyn, she said, twisting the hem of her apron. When you brought Bee back from the storm with the smoke. Yes. Mistress Gable, the saloon keeper's wife. She is not just a saloon keeper. She is the midwife, May said, the words coming in a rush. She delivered Finn. I watched. She knows how to catch them, how to stop the bleeding. I want to learn that. Evelyn stared, stunned. I do not just want to get married and have babies, May said, her face red, her eyes fierce. I want to save them, like you saved Bee. She took a deep breath. Will you ask her if I can study with her? I will sweep the saloon floor. I will wash her linens. I do not care.
I want to learn." Evelyn felt a surge of pride so powerful it almost knocked her over. "I will ask her. May, I will." She smiled. But a nurse needs more than just brave hands. She needs to read. She needs to read books about medicine and write down what she learns. "I can read," May said defensively. "You can read the Bible. I will teach you to read a medical journal. I will teach you to write in a clear, strong hand, so that when you speak to a doctor, he will listen to you not as a girl, but as a colleague." May's eyes, so long full of suspicion, now shone with a future. "A colleague," she whispered, testing the word. She nodded, her face set with a new, adult determination. The last of the winter's shadows lifted when Marshal Brody rode out to the ranch. Silas Ward, he reported, had been taken to Cheyenne. His confession, combined with the testimony of Jeb Carter and the full weight of the railroad's public disgrace, meant he would not be returning for a very long time. "And the railroad?" Luke asked, his arm now healing, the sling gone. "Oh, they are coming," the marshal said, spitting tobacco into the mud. "But they are not coming through your valley. They are rerouting 10 miles to the south, and the new contract they signed, it guarantees water rights for every rancher in the county. You did that, Luke, you and your family." That evening, the house was quiet. The children were asleep. The new barn stood dark and solid against the stars, its roof sound. Evelyn was in the main room, mending a tear in Cal's shirt. Luke came and stood by the mantel. He was holding her silver locket in his hand, the one he had found on her dresser. He looked at it, then at the heavy, flower-stamped saddle that he had saved from the fire. The saddle now hung in the place of honor on the wall, a symbol of his past, of his father. He took a small, new nail and a hammer. With his scarred, healing hand, he carefully hammered the nail into the wooden wall, right beside the saddle. He walked over to Evelyn. He did not speak. He just held out his hand. She understood. She unclasped the thin silver chain and placed the locket, her only connection to her own past, into his palm. He walked back to the mantel. He hung the small, dented locket on the new nail. It hung there, silver and fragile, next to the heavy, dark leather of the saddle. 2 relics, 2 pasts, 2 stories of survival. He stepped back. He put his good arm around Evelyn's waist, pulling her close. They stood together, looking at the wall. It was no longer his wall. It was theirs, one home. The wedding was not a grand affair. There was no white dress, no carriage, no crowds. Spring had come to the high plains, a shy, tentative green pushing up through the mud. And they held it in the backyard, just as the sun was setting. Evelyn wore her best gray dress, the one she had mended so many times. But May and Bee had spent the morning weaving a wreath for her hair from the first pale buffalo grass and the tiny, tough purple flowers that grew by the spring. Pastor Davies stood before them, his Bible in his hand. His face was no longer strained, but clear. He had come to them, hat in hand, a week after the hearing, and apologized for his weakness. Luke had simply nodded and invited him to supper. Now, he was here as a friend. The only guests were Old Man Hemlock, who had closed his forge for the afternoon, and Mistress Davies, who was holding a sleepy Finn. The other 4 children stood in a ragged, excited line, their faces scrubbed clean. The new barn, a solid, proud structure of fresh yellow pine, stood behind them, its roof sharp against the soft evening sky. Pastor Davies kept his words brief, as he had been asked. He spoke of resilience, of community, and of the house that was built upon a rock. He spoke of the family not as a thing of blood, but as a thing of choice, a covenant. Luke's left arm was healed, though the shoulder would always be stiff. He stood tall, his good suit brushed clean, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face. "Do you, Luke McCrae, take this woman, Evelyn Hart, to be your wedded wife, to love, to honor, and to work beside, as long as you both shall live?"
I do, Luke said, his voice deep and steady, a vow that echoed off the new barn wall. And do you, Evelyn Hart, the pastor said, his voice softening, take this man, Luke McCrae, to be your wedded husband, to love, to honor, and to work beside, as long as you both shall live. Evelyn looked at Luke. She looked at May, who was smiling through her tears. She looked at Cal, who was standing still for once, his face serious. She looked at Jonah, and Bee, and Finn. Her table, it was full. I do, she whispered. Then, by the authority vested in me by God and the great territory of Nebraska, the pastor said, I pronounce you man and wife. Luke did not hesitate. He did not ask. He put his large, scarred hands on her waist, and he kissed her. It was not the chaste, grateful kiss from the storm. It was a husband's kiss. It was full of promise and respect, and a deep, slow-burning warmth that made her feel safe, right down to her bones. A whoop went up from Cal. May and Bee cheered, and Finn clapped his small hands, laughing at the noise. It was the sound of a family being born. Later that night, after the children were asleep, after the small celebration of cake and coffee had ended, the two of them stood on the porch, looking out at the land. The moon was high, silvering the new grass. I have no easy promises for you, Evelyn, Luke said quietly, his arm around her. This land? It is hard. The winters will be long. There will be droughts. There will be sickness. I know, she said, leaning her head against his good shoulder. I do not want easy promises. I will not promise you a soft life, he said, his voice low. But I will promise this. I will work by your side every day. I will listen to your counsel. I will guard your heart. I will be your partner, in the sun and in the storm. And I, she said, turning to face him, will promise to work beside you. I will hold this house. I will raise these children, and I will love you, Luke McCrae, every single day. The future they had promised each other began the next morning. It was built of small things. The kitchen schoolhouse, as Luke called it, opened its doors. Evelyn, with Luke's full support, had sent word to the neighboring ranches. 2 afternoons a week. Her kitchen was no longer just a kitchen. It was a school. 6 children from the adjoining ranches, children who were too far from town to attend a proper school, now sat at her long table. Evelyn taught them reading and arithmetic. May, her first and most serious student, helped the younger ones with their letters, her voice patient and firm. The house was filled with the sound of chalk on slate, of children's voices reciting their times tables. Evelyn Hart, the 19-year-old orphan who had arrived with nothing but a Bible, had become the teacher for the entire valley. Luke, for his part, fulfilled his own promise. He had been named guardian of the spring, and he took the duty seriously. He rode to every ranch that shared the water. He did not ask for money. He asked for labor. He organized a water fund, a community agreement. Every rancher pledged 2 days of work a season to maintain the troughs, to keep the springhead clear, to ensure the water that had saved them all would be protected for generations. The law of the stone and the law of the steel had become the law of the neighbors. Prairie's End was changing. The railroad did come, 10 miles to the south. As the marshal had said, it brought new people, new goods, new money. The town grew, but it grew with a new, harder spine. The lessons of the hearing had been seared into the town's memory. The council, led by a humbled Pastor Davies, wrote a new charter for the town. The first article, written in clear, bold ink in the council book, was the community water law, guaranteeing that no corporation, no matter how powerful, could ever again threaten the valley's bloodline. One day, a rider left a package on the fence post. There was no note. Inside was a cured bison hide, soft and thick. Evelyn knew it was from Chayton. She laid it on the floor in front of the hearth. a piece of the wild, sacred land now warming their home. A month later, a message came, passed from a trapper to Mr. Henderson. The first herds of bison had been seen crossing the spreading river, far to the north. It was a good omen. The land was healthy. The message said Chayton would return when the stars turned in the sky, and the wind spoke of winter. Their family was not one of blood. It was one chosen. It was forged in fire and ice, and a quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. Their love was not a sudden, bright flame. It was a habit. It was the simple, daily repetition of kindness. It was Luke, bringing her a cup of coffee in the pre-dawn dark. It was Evelyn, mending his coat, her stitches small and strong. It was the two of them, standing together, a united front when Cal broke a window, or when Bee had nightmares. One morning, just as the sun was rising, Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway. The house was quiet. The sun, a low, golden light, streamed through the clean window. It struck the wall where her locket and his saddle hung. The silver caught the light, a small, bright star. Beside it, the light caught the leather of the belt Chayton had given her, which she had hung on the saddle horn. The carved waves seemed to move, to flow in the morning sun. Two worlds, two pasts, a small, dented locket from a lost, civilized life, a carved leather belt from a wild, ancient one. They hung together, breathing in the same quiet, morning air. They were one. Spring turned to a warm, green summer. The new calves were born, fat and healthy, drinking from the clear, protected stream. The new, expanded herd was strong. May took her lessons with Mistress Gable, her determination a fierce, bright thing. She learned to bind wounds, to set a splint, to identify fevers. In late August, she sat for an examination with the circuit doctor, who was passing through. He questioned her for 2 hours. He left, stunned, telling Luke that his daughter had more practical medical knowledge than most men he knew. May had passed. She was, at 12 years old, a certified apprentice nurse. Cal, his restless anger now channeled, spent his hours with old man Hemlock at the forge. He was learning to work leather. He was not just mending harness. He was creating. For his father's birthday, he presented him with a new saddle, rough but strong. It was the first saddle he had ever made, and Luke declared it the finest in the territory. Jonah, his love of numbers now a passion, sat with Evelyn every Tuesday night. He was no longer just counting beans. He was learning the ledger. He marked the cost of feed, the price of steers, the cost of flour. He was 8 years old, and he was, as Luke proudly called him, the ranch's bookkeeper. Bee, her fear of the singing storm now gone, had found a new love. She, who had seen the maps that tried to steal their land, was now making her own. With charcoal and scraps of paper, she drew the house and the new barn. She drew the path to the spring. She was drawing a map, not of ownership but of belonging. And Finn, the silent, 4-year-old shadow, was silent no longer. He sat on the bison hide in front of the fire every night. In the new, warm circle of the hearth school, he was pointing to the letters Cal and Evelyn drew on the big slate. One night, Evelyn wrote 4 letters, H-O-M-E. Home, Finn said, his small voice clear and proud. He pointed at Evelyn, and at Luke, and at his brothers and sisters. Home. Evelyn looked at Luke over the children's heads. Her husband smiled, his eyes full of a quiet, profound love. She was 19 years old. She had been sent, a virgin, an orphan, to a broken man and his 5 children. And in the heart of the wild, empty west, in the smoke and the fury, she had found everything. She had found her full table. She was home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are listening from. So please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and say hello. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you would like to help this story reach more people, please consider hitting that hype button to show your support. We will see you in the next story.